Good morning, everyone. Glad to see those whom I can't see and those whom I can't see. Welcome to the Family Court Annual Conference. And before we officially begin, I want to introduce our new Chief Judge of the District of Columbia Superior Court, Anita Josie Herring, who's going to make some opening remarks, and then I'll follow up behind her with brief remarks, and then we'll get started. Chief Judge.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Judge Krauthammer, for inviting me to give welcoming remarks for the 18th Annual Family Court Conference. It's amazing to know that 18 years have gone by since the first conference. I've had a look at the agenda, and I tell you, it's such an important topic: coercion in families and the impact of that on families and children. And I really want to commend you all for pushing forward on this vital subject. I want to thank the amazing staff of the courts, Center for Education and Training, the Superior Court Family Division, Georgetown University, and of course, Delaney and Stafford. I also want to thank the members of the audience who are participating for all the hard work they do to keep families strong. For those of you who have been on the journey a long time, keep moving. And for those of you who are just great work. We know that this is a tough topic, coercion in relationships, because we know we see people all over have been impacted by coercion and violence in families. The problem, of course, is that those concerns that normally are kept in the family often these days, because the resources spill over into our court system. Sometimes we see people with other issues that result from how they've been impacted by coercion and violence in their families. Our most vulnerable citizens, children, often present in court as truants, or using drugs, and are involved in other behaviors because they're just trying to not think about what's happening in their homes. And so as you do your work, I think it's important that you have expertise, and you have a number here today that will give you tools to do your job better. You have Professor Epstein from Georgetown Law Center, Evan Stark, who studies the health effects of interpersonal violence, and Ms. Kit Gruelle, who's a victim. I think you have a great program, and I hope you learn a lot. Stay strong, and welcome to the conference.
Thank you, Chief Judge Josie Herring, for those remarks. We're going to kick this off. I just want to say that this program has been over 2 years in the making. It was started by suggestion by Lynn Delaney, who did a presentation to the family court at our family court training, and we just started talking, and we were interested in the topic, and she's been instrumental, along with others obviously, in pushing this forward. So this is a kind of strange circumstances. As we all know, this year 2020 is just the hits keep coming and coming, and this is our first virtual family court conference. However, the topic, as Chief Judge has alluded to, is very real. It's very real. There's nothing virtual about the topic. And the beauty of this topic, and I don't mean that the topic itself is beauty, but the relevance of this topic is that it cuts across all of the courts in the family court. It affects every party who comes before the family court. So it's relevant to everyone. There's not one single branch within the family court that's not affected by these issues. After saying that, I'm going to cede the floor to Professor Epstein to get the ball rolling. Thank you, and enjoy the program.
Thank you, Judge. I want to echo the court, Judge Krauthammer's thanks to Lynn Delaney whose experience working with families who are dealing with coercive control led her to propose this conference topic to the court. And so what we're doing here today is really her brainchild. So thank you, Lynn. I also want to note for people who are participating that at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. Maybe it's at the top of some people's screen, but there's a Q&A button. If you want to type in questions as we go, we're going to try to reserve time at the end for those questions. But if you type them in, I'll see them and try to relay them to the panelists at the end of the conference. Okay, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you today Evan Stark. Dr. Stark is Professor Emeritus of Public Affairs and Public Health at Rutgers University, a founder of one of the first shelters for abused women in the United States. Professor Stark has since then served as an expert in more than 100 civil and criminal cases, including the infamous Nicholson case, where the New York Court of Appeals held unconstitutional New York City's practice of removing children from abused mothers in cases where the sole allegation of neglect was that these mothers had been unable to protect their children from witnessing the abuse that was being inflicted on the women themselves. Professor Stark's incredibly influential and award-winning 2007 book, Coercive Control, challenged activists, lawyers, policymakers, and researchers to adopt a new understanding of domestic violence. He showed us how physical violence, on which we tend to focus so heavily, especially in the court system, is often not, in fact, the heart of intimate partner abuse. Instead, in many relationships, violence is just one aspect of something far more profound, which is the abusive partner's violation of a victim's fundamental right to self-determination. We are incredibly fortunate to have Evan Stark here with us today, all the way from New Jersey. And so I'm going to turn it over to you, Professor Stark.
Thank you, Deborah. Let me figure out how to do things. I'll share the screen.
Perfect.
Are we up now? I think.
Yes.
Okay. I'm speaking to you actually from Connecticut, which is where I live. And I retired from Rutgers, I think about the last time I spoke at a DC family court meeting, which was about 12 years ago, I think. But it's really a tremendous opportunity to do so, and this is a tremendous privilege to have this audience. What I'm going to do this morning, I'm going to make sure I can move my slide. So, slide's not moving. The first thing I want to do is I want to share a short film with you. This is the story of Jennifer Magnano. I don't know if you remember her case. In 2007, her husband, Scott, took her life and then took his own life. She had come back from California, where she was in refuge with her shelter, with her 3 children, Jessica, David, and Emily, under the false belief that she needed to make a personal appearance in family court to respond to an order to show cause why Scott shouldn't be given custody of the children. The police were aware that Scott was stalking her, and they escorted her to the house and did a cursory search of the house before she went there to stay overnight before going to court. He was hiding in the closet. He came out, he took her life. He left the scene. They later found him victim of his own suicide in the woods in the car. And the newspapers described this murder-suicide as the tragic result of a messy, ugly divorce. This film, the 3 scenes I'm going to show you from this film, Jennifer 42 is called, are based on interviews with the children. The children describe in these scenes what I'm going to be talking with you about this morning, namely the spectrum of coercive control tactics to which children in these families are being subjected, as well as their mothers.
The house was kind of divided between where we could and could not go. We were always in the playroom on the second floor of the house. We weren't really allowed to go anywhere else.
You could go into my sister's room because it was across the hall from the playroom and didn't interfere in his path. Like, so long as you didn't cross the hall when he was going up and down the hall.
We weren't allowed to just come out and go to the bathroom or go out and get a glass of water or go out in the kitchen just like get a snack or just go play in our rooms. We'd get in trouble if the playroom was too messy. I'd get in trouble if Emily was making too much noise. She was, 12 years younger than me, so I was responsible for her.
We had to be quiet and be clean, and every time he would walk by, I would be scared that I was doing something wrong. I was scared to act out or make a mess or do anything that a normal kid would do because I knew that it would probably get my mom in trouble.
Getting ready for school, we had to, I'm not exaggerating, tiptoe past his room. And once we left our bedroom, you couldn't go back in your bedroom. So you better have everything you need from your room for to head off to school. You couldn't go back in there. If he was in the bathroom, you weren't even allowed to go to that end of the house. Everything she did was controlled. Her whole day was about just meeting his needs. The only solace I feel like she ever got was in the morning, her cup of coffee before he was up. But even then, it's just walking on eggshells until he's awake. His tea had to be ready. She would have to make him breakfast sandwiches. It had to be done a certain way. The sandwich had to be cut a certain way. There had to always be all these different options. And she would basically just have to stand there, just waiting in the kitchen, just waiting for whatever he wanted or needed her to do next.
The food that we ate had to be perfect. It had to be to his standards.
She waited on him hand and foot. Never in the room, always in the kitchen. She'd only ever come out of the kitchen at certain prearranged times where she'd bring us a drink. She wouldn't leave and just come hang out with us or anything. She was at the counter all day. Even if there was nothing to do, she had to stay anywhere else.
She had to do what he told her to do when he told her to do it. Because if she made the wrong facial expression, he just bashed her.
Occasionally he'd be in a good mood and he'd be calm, but everyone else was always tense. And everything had to go exactly according to plan.
Him taking a shower was a production. You'd have an hour, 2 hour window. So we waited till he was in the shower.
On the only day that Jennifer ever tried to leave Scott, there had been plans kind of in the works for Jennifer to try to leave Scott in June. He struck her, and he also assaulted Jessica. And as a result, Jennifer made the decision that they were going to leave that night. And part of Scott Magnano's, the way his demeanor was that he had ritual patterns, and one of them was this evening shower he took.
We hid garbage bags in all of our rooms, and the second we heard the shower go, went into our rooms, took as much clothes and as much like important possessions as we could.
I'm like I've been waiting for this moment. I've been pushing for it, wanting it, and it was so exciting. But now I'm like, oh my gosh, like what if something goes wrong? Or like, anyway, she calls. It was late. I was on the road hovering. And she said, this guy's in the shower and now is the time. And we were like, oh my gosh.
We snuck out through the garage, and once we got outside, we put all of our stuff into my mom's van, and then we just left.
We didn't even turn the van on, we just took it out, put it in neutral, rolled out of the driveway. And we didn't turn it on until we got to the street.
And then we were like, well, crap, like, now what? We can't just come right back to my house because that's gonna be the obvious place. So I'm like, all right, because I'm a big mastermind, right? But I gotta have a plan because I'm blindsided. I didn't see this coming like tonight.
Driving away was a really weird feeling because it was a mixture of being so ecstatic that we were finally gone, but also being so terrified that it was going to be short-lived and he was going to find us. It was kind of like a dream where I kept thinking, like, how are we going to survive? Because we didn't have anything.
We ended up in Torrington at this little dive hotel. And it was dirty and but so we did. We went in there and, the kids it was fantastic. They felt like, they kept, we're free.
Jessica shaved my legs in the bathtub, and we were jumping on the bed and just doing all these things that we couldn't do before and just enjoying this freedom. Even though it was in a motel, it was like the best night of my life, just being so happy and being with my mom and seeing her smile.
The the Magnano case was a very important one for me personally, both because I was one of the people who had helped get the Magnano family to California to shelter, but also just the voluminous amount of material that we produced when we did the case review was a very important basis for our deepened understanding of coercive control and the extent to which a lot of the things that we were doing in the court system in Connecticut were actually exacerbating rather than relieving the problems. Basically, what I'm going to do this morning with you is try to present a new paradigm in dealing with children in domestic violence situations. In general, I'm going to convince you, I hope, that coercive control, not domestic violence, is the most common context for child abuse, child kidnapping, and non-accidental child fatality. I've published a number of articles, and there's now voluminous research literature supporting what we've been doing for about 35 years, showing that apart from domestic violence, there is really no significant cause for child fatality or serious child injury, non-accidental child injury, that is dealt with by, was seen in the family court, by pediatric medicine, or by child welfare. Now, what we are aware of is that what we attributed very often to domestic violence actually occurs much more commonly in the context of coercive control. That when child abuse occurs, secondly, in the context of coercive control, it's a form of secondary victimization. And I'll be reinforcing this point throughout the morning. But by secondary victimization, I of course do not mean that the harms to children are secondary in importance. To the contrary, they're often primary importance. What I mean is that the victimization of children in the context of coercive control is almost always the secondary intent of the perpetrator, whose primary interest is in monopolizing the resources and power in the family as a whole, or in the extended unit as a whole of the family, particularly with respect to the most immediate object, his partner, his female partner, usually. This is going to turn out to be incredibly important, particularly when we try to understand, as we have in many of my cases, why men who have no previous histories of violence or even animosity toward their children nonetheless exhibit ferocious brutality towards children, completely out of the blue, seemingly, spewing their venom, as it were, which seems to be wholly unpredictable, since in the past, as the newspapers in the Magnano case emphasized, Scott had only expressed his venom toward his wife, Jennifer. And what we will see is that when we understand that child maltreatment takes place, child abuse takes place in the context of this secondary victimization process of coercive control, we can understand why a perpetrator whose intention is not to hurt the child will nonetheless kill children whom he otherwise seemingly loves, because his primary objective is to exert control, to exert power over his primary victim, which is his wife. The third thing I want to convey to you today, and I hope this, you're not expecting to only be depressed by what we say, because there's a great deal, in my view, of good news, and God knows we can use it these days, is that child abuse and child maltreatment, when it takes place in the context of coercive control, can be prevented in whole or in large part by removing the perpetrator. And that, in fact, is what we are doing in much of Europe today. And I'm gonna, in the first part of my presentation this morning, I'm gonna talk a little bit about what we've been doing in England and Scotland, just to give you some sense of how the bridge between the family court, the criminal court, and the child welfare system has been bridged by taking a larger holistic perspective towards coercive control. This is just quickly to outline the logic, as I see it at least, of my presentation. I will review, if only briefly, why we developed the concept of coercive control to replace what was going on and what had taken us so far in the domestic violence revolution, why our revolution had stalled. Secondly, I'll emphasize that the initial conception of coercive control, which I and others brought forward about 20 years ago, now there are over 1,000 monographs on coercive control. Dozens of countries have adopted it as legislation, as policy. Throughout the United States, there's renewed interest in it, even in this time of relative famine and social policy. But one of the things that has occurred, and I'll show you the evolution of this in a few minutes, is that we've recognized that coercive control is not a crime against women, but a spectrum offense. That is to say that it is an offense that is committed albeit with the primary victim being the female partner usually, but is committed against a spectrum of individuals who represent obstacles to acquiring and controlling all of the resources in the family space. And that includes grandparents, it includes SIDS, it includes these 3 children, the Magnano children. Again, as secondary victims, because their victimization is not the primary objective of the perpetrator, but nevertheless they are co-victims. And it also may include co-workers, it includes police. In some of the cases that we're involved in, we are finding literally dozens of persons who have been affected by these perpetrators. It is by no means a family offense, but a spectrum offense. I'll describe to you the elements of the coercive control of children so that you can recognize it. Briefly, they are virtually identical to the elements that we see men using with the coercive control of their wives and partners, except with the added and very important dimension that children are often found to be colluding, enlisted in the coercive control of the partners. And the collusion of children is a very important part of their control in this schema. And I don't think I'll have time. If we had all day, I would present case evidence from some of my cases in New York and elsewhere. We'll be taking family cases to the Supreme Court, where children have actually been enlisted to testify against relatives who have sued for custody when the perpetrator has been given custody by the family court of the children of women of a partner he has killed in the child's presence. And the child has expressed the wish under the collusion and under the control of the perpetrator to support him. And finally, I'm going to emphasize how important we've learned it to be to listen to children's voices in this process. And by that, I don't mean necessarily just literally listening to children's voices, hearing what they say, although that is critically important, as you've heard from these short vignettes in the Magnano case. But it means learning to understand and read through children's strategies, how they are intuiting, how are they responding, how are they reacting, how are they experiencing coercive control. Hopefully by the end of this morning, we won't any longer talk about witnessing domestic violence. Even when children are witnessing domestic violence, they are being strategic, they tell us. But witnessing is far, far, far too passive a concept to even begin to understand or intuit the nuanced ways in which children, multiple experiences of coercive control impact upon their lives. So let me just back up and walk us back forward to where we've come. We started 50 years ago or so. Kit and I were young and spring-fed in those days, starting battered women's programs. And this is our model, the violence model, the assault and violence model. And somewhere along the line, and we made enormous achievements. I'm not going to minimize, I don't want to minimize. In my book, I go to great lengths to celebrate the incredible achievements of the domestic violence revolution. But the fact of the matter is, and all of this data is widely available, so I'm not going to review it today, except to refer to it, that our domestic violence revolution has stalled. Just to give you one example from the homicide data, with all the police reforms in place, mandatory arrest, all of the tremendous sheltering we provided for hundreds of thousands of women, by 2020, we could say, and by 2010, it was already clear that we had reduced overall domestic homicides an enormous amount, somewhere around 60 to 70%. This was an incredible achievement of the domestic violence revolution. Except that when we looked more closely at the data, what we discovered was that almost the entire benefit of this reduction occurred in the reduction of women killing men. That the numbers of women who were being killed by men did not decline almost at all, and that the numbers of African-American women who were being killed by male partners had actually increased somewhat. I could tell many more statistics that presented similar paradoxes. But the result was that even though there was a substantial decline in serious injury reported by women from men, in large part due to mandatory arrest policies, the absolute number of physical assaults that women were reporting to us in our shelters was increasing. And as I shall show you momentarily, one of the things we learned from coercive control was that the measurement of injury in a domestic violence case is a reflection of its frequency and its cumulative effect over time, not its severity. Severity of injury is a very poor indicator, it turns out, for the likelihood that a domestic violence case will result in a homicide, or even that it will result in a high level of entrapment. Rather, it is duration. And women were telling us in the shelters, violence wasn't the worst part, and yet we were focused solely on violence. All of the other harms, humiliations, the things that children described that Scott McNanna was making them do in his house, all of those things were off the table. In England, where we introduced the first laws, stalking, sexual violence, estranged homicide, femicide, gaslighting, they all were outside the framework that was being dealt with in the domestic violence arena. Even though the women in our shelters were telling us repeatedly, violence wasn't the worst part. I remember as if it was yesterday, the first woman I hid in our house over 50 years ago, when she told me that, when she told me violence wasn't the worst part ever, I redirected her as I had been myself redirected so often by my colleagues to talk about the violence. What we're going to learn is that the harms, the humiliations that we're dealing with are harms to dignity, harms to autonomy, harms to personhood, harms to society, harms to economy, that are easily as significant in terms of their impact on humanity and on women's development as the physical harms and the sexual harms women suffer. And we'll learn that children are telling us the same thing, that it is their dignity and their purpose in life and their sense of honor, that when we listen to their voices, they speak about the ways in which Scott McNanna made them organize their shoes and accountable for their time on the phone and what have you, that those things, those restrictions on their liberties were far more fundamental and critical in terms of their ultimate development than anything else. And there were high-profile cases that made us realize that violence was not the ultimate issue that we should be concerned about. Plus, we had a new model of coercive control. And we had another way of looking at things that told us that we could have a much more comprehensive understanding of what abuse looked like and probably resolve some of the dilemmas. I'm just going to quickly show you some of the data that impressed us in England. And I could have presented similar data to you on the United States, but it is in England that this data was the basis for changing policy. This just gives you an idea of attrition. We could do the same thing with any police force in the United States. These are 3 areas in Northeast England. And you can see out of 869 reports to the police, only a tiny percentage of them result in charges, even when arrest was routine. 222 is a lot of arrests. Almost a quarter of the cases result in arrest, but almost no incidents result in conviction. This will give you an imprisonment. Almost nobody went to jail. And nobody went to jail in the United States for domestic violence. When I say nobody, I don't mean literally nobody. I mean, as a percentage of the number of calls, the percentage of people who actually end up going to jail is minuscule, was minuscule, and remains minuscule. Less than 1%. And what you'll see in a minute is that in the average case of domestic violence, whose duration is 5.5 years, as long, according to Jackie Campbell's research at Hopkins, as 7.2 years. My research was 5.5 years, so I give you a more conservative estimate. In those average cases, there are hundreds of incidents, typically, sometimes thousands of incidents. And so if 1% is going to jail, that's not just 1% of the incidents, that's 1% of the men arrested and reported. It's an even more minuscule percentage of the domestic violence assaults, so small as to be trivial. I give you this example just because I wanted one in my caseload. This is a brother of a friend of mine, Mike Green, who was a police chief in Lansing, Michigan, who was murdered by a guy who was out on parole. He and his wife were killed. And the killer was described as a narcissistic sociopath with no known history of violence. And my friend, Laurie Post, who's a professor at Yale, one of my colleagues, and she and I didn't have anything to do during the trial. So we started going through the police records. And we found this killer with no known history of violence had 132 independent events, domestic violence events, over 32 years against dozens of women, multiple domestic violence, stalking offenses, sexual abuse offenses, threats to kill, child abuse, and what have you. And we thought, oh, well, and we were interested in this information because we didn't want the guy to be transferred to out of maximum security because we were really worried about the guy hurting somebody, even though he was in prison, reaching out of the prison, hurting somebody else. So we presented this to the prosecutor in Michigan. And the response was, what does that have to do with the real violence of the murder? And again, I'm presenting this to you to give you the sense that one of the effects of our focusing on domestic violence was to normalize and trivialize the cuts with 1,000, or the death by 1,000 cuts that were going on in women's lives every day. And which led a guy like this psychopathic killer, who wasn't psychopathic at all, but a classic barra, to stay on the street after repeatedly being brought to the attention of the courts and the authorities because all they could see him through was the window of the individual incident. 79 to 86 of every 100 cases reported to the police involve ongoing abuse. We didn't know this in England until we looked at the National Crime Survey and began to aggregate the data, because these records were not aggregated on the basis of individual offenders, they were disaggregated on the basis of individual offenses. But this means, this tells us, as epidemiologists, this tells us, and God knows we've all had kitsch epidemiology up to the zoo over the last 3 months from Dr. Fauci and Dr. Trump. This tells us as amateur epidemiologists that when you got 79 to 86% of 100 cases are ongoing, that if you get in early, you can turn domestic violence abuse from an epidemic problem to a minor problem. right? You can reduce it by 76 to 80% to just the incidence. We call that in epidemiology reducing prevalence to incidence. And the incidence of domestic violence is very small in our community, very small. It's about 5%, less than 5%. But the prevalence, because there are all of these people who are committing horrendously repetitive acts, multiple acts. I have time for Sally challenge. Sally, I'll bring up Sally because Sally challenge case in which I testified before the Royal High Court of Appeals was one of the key things that spurred the British government to move beyond a titular adherence to coercive control to really a commitment to enforce the law nationwide. Sally hit her husband 28 times with a hammer, killing him. She was serving him lunch. He had sent her out to buy her food. They had been separated. They were back together again. They'd been married for 40 years. While she was out for lunch, he had apparently gotten on the phone with his girlfriend. There was some talk about it getting back together. She brought back the lunch. She made it on the stove. She served it to him. And then when he sat down to eat, she took the hammer and she hit him with the hammer. After beating him with the hammer 28 times, she wrapped him in a rug, and then she went out to pick up her son at work. After that, she took herself out to a popular place where suicides were committed in Coventry, England, and a minister talked her down. And she was put on trial and she was convicted of murder. She put on a battered women's offense, but there was very little violence in the 40-year marriage. There were a few incidents that were dramatic, a rape, some sexual assault, but very, very little. And she was convicted and got a long prison sentence. In February 2019, in a case in which I testified, the court overturned Sally's conviction because of the appearance of new evidence. And the new evidence which prompted the court's response was an understanding of coercive control that had not been available at her original trial. In the months following, the Crown dropped all charges against Sally. Two other women who had killed their husbands in virtually identical situations, but there was no apparent provocation, immediate provocation. They dropped all charges against them. And the idea was, and this became the cornerstone for a massive campaign on our part, that simply expanding Sally's abuse, the understanding of Sally's abuse, to encompass the broad range of oppressive acts during the relationship and their effects on all aspects of her existence, changed the context of her behavior. The fact that she had had no money, the fact that he had dictated her clothes, the fact that he'd managed her going to work, that he'd monitored her phone calls, that he controlled virtually every aspect of her mental thinking, so that at the time she killed him, she answered to her voice, his own voice in herself. She separated from him. She set up her own house by herself. And she told me that when she looked in the mirror and she asked herself, what shall I do today? All she could hear was an echo of his voice. He had made of her nothing but an encampment of himself. And we were able to convince the court of that. And there were numerous other examples that came out of the woodwork. Nigella Lawson, one of the popular fashion reporters in Europe, came forward and described a history of her relationship, not involving any physical violence at all, but with the intimidation and all of the rest was enormous. The Home Office, and we had the model of coercive control, which I just put up, which described abuse as a pattern of behavior, an ongoing pattern, multifaceted, designed to establish entrapment through a process of disempowerment involving these elements, at least. The Home Office under Theresa May, she was not yet Prime Minister, she was Home Secretary, adopted from my book of coercive control this definition of coercive controlling behavior, and it became the single definition for all of England, for the health services, for the family services, for the child protection services, for all of the services that had to do with women and children and families. This became the prevailing definition, replaced 20 other definitions that were out there of domestic violence. It had no legal standing. In order for it to have legal standing, we had to negotiate for about 3 years, and we got a statute called S-76, a coercive control offense. It's not a very good one, but I want to give you some example of how things have changed in England and how things have changed now in Scotland and Ireland and China and Taiwan and Australia and many other places which have adopted coercive control legislation. Most recently, I think on the family side in California, 2 weeks ago. Mohammed Anwar admitted forcing Jennifer Doherty to behave how he wanted for over a year, restricting who she could see, what she was allowed to wear, and what not to eat. Now, understand, this would not have been a criminal offense. He used fear to make her run on a treadmill every day. He showed her a picture. He had a picture of there, Farrah Fawcett, and he wanted her to have a body like Farrah Fawcett. And telling her she did not look as good as they did. Again, in the past, nothing would have happened. This would have made its way as a bad divorce. It would have made its way through the criminal process in case after case, producing the attrition records that I showed you from our police data. And instead, Anwar got 28 months sentence. The court found that he had 10 offenses, and there were dozens of examples like that. Let me also go back just a second. I wanted to point out, but I didn't, what the effect of the attrition data was on the police. I know we're talking about other things, but I want to make clear why we had the support we did, the broad base of support for new law. As a result of the attrition data, what we created in the policing in England and Scotland and elsewhere in the United States is virtually a revolving door through which the same offenders passed again and again and again without consequence. Police, in particular, were extraordinarily frustrated, particularly in the smallest towns in England, where they were quite aware of who these guys were and that they were still on the street. Some police began to give feedback to the victims in these cases, wondering why victims in these cases didn't leave. But more importantly, police became frustrated and their own response became more and more uneven and more untrustworthy. Morale dropped. Domestic violence policing was the most common source of policing in England, and it was the one where police exhibited the lowest morale. Today, when we present coercive control policing, we fill football stadiums in Liverpool with police and with representatives of bad women's groups. Advocates get together. Now, what about the children? And I want to, in the time we have, just now talk about that. So we have new laws. And we have a new model on the block. And we have a new way of understanding abuse, which we believe will give us a handle on prevention, albeit with the stick of enforcement, that will allow us to take a significant number of people off the street for a significant period of time, that will allow women and children the freedom they need to get on with their life projects and make our community a safer place to be. It doesn't mean putting more people in jail, but it does mean putting chronic offenders in jail for a crime that is being committed in our very midst and depriving a significant number of women and children of basic rights and liberties. Now, what about the children? We've known, again, for 50 years. Our research at Yale, my wife, Ann Flitcraft, and mine, 50 years ago, showed that domestic violence was far and away the leading context in which children were abused. There wasn't anything else that even came close. I'm talking about physical abuse now, that when children, that of all the children that came with non-accidental injuries to Yale New Haven Hospital, to other hospitals, Boston Hospital, when Eli Neuberger did his research, far and away, the most common cause and source of the child injury and child fatality in those caseloads was domestic violence. All the other causes combined that got all the money, alcoholism, mental health issues, anything else you can think of, paled in comparison. We knew that. And we knew that we could identify the men who committed the child abuse. We had data from the welfare system, we had data from the hospital system, we had data from the policing, we had data and we had the national child abuse data, that when men are present, 2/3 of the reported incidents were committed by men, but also that even when men were not officially present, they were present. Because we now understood that the risk in domestic violence cases was actually as great or greater when people were separated and divorced as when they were single. In fact, all of the demographic research we have shows that married women are actually the safest from the standpoint of domestic violence. The highest risks are women who are single, separated, and divorced. And that abuse doesn't change when people separate and divorce. It usually increases, although it may change its form. And when we talked about children, we thought their risks primarily had to do with witnessing. This was the kind of poster that we produced based on that belief. A child witnessing these horrible things going on. She's an outsider and he's only angry at the wife, but she's seeing it happen. And the trauma of this witnessing is the thing that we try as judges, or we try as experts, or we try as lawyers to get into the mind of the child, to see as the child would see, to suffer as the child would suffer, and to stand back from these parents who are somehow indifferent to that child's feeling. But it turns out this is not at all what children tell us when we talk to them. This is not what children tell us at all when we talk to them, that they are merely passive witnesses, that they are hiding under the bed. Joe Torre, the manager of the New York Yankees, told me that when he and his brothers came home and they saw their father's car outside from school, and they saw their father's car parks outside, father's Cadillac parks outside their house, they knew he was abusing their mother. And they knew they had left their sister, they had experienced it, and they went somewhere else. And to this day, Joe Torre cries in my office, cries because of the failure that he feels he and his brothers went through, that he failed as a son, and he felt dishonorable, and he still feels dishonorable because of that effect. There's no way that a passive term like witnessing can begin to describe what his father was doing to him. And his father was teaching him a lesson. He knew that by telling him he couldn't come in and protect his mother. And we had positive data too that made us a little hesitant to push out the message that children were being harmed by witnessing domestic violence. And most children exposed to domestic violence were psychologically intact. And that even most women who were physically abused for many, many years had an ordinary magic and competence in the face of adversity that left them available to their children. And yet, what we found, and this takes us to Nicholson, was that when children were present, no matter how much we understood about domestic violence, no matter how many protocols we put on the books about who we should make priorities, and we should question people about domestic violence and be sensitive in our police departments to the fact that the mother was only doing what she had to do because she was being abused. And our child welfare departments had protocols. I helped write the protocols for the New York City Child Welfare Department. In fact, in the Nicholson case, where we sued them for taking the children away from mothers solely because the mothers were victims of domestic violence, they were basing that policy in part on the work of Stark and Flitcraft at Yale. That was the first footnote in the commissioner's policy. We had tremendous ambiguity about where a woman's victimization ended and her responsibility for harms to children began. And that ambiguity permeated the family court, and it permeated the child welfare system. A battered mother was somehow a contradiction in terms. Remember the venom that even feminists unleashed at Hedda Nussbaum in that old case in New York, you may remember, when little Lisa Nussbaum was starved to death. And the fact that Hedda herself was tied up, and that Hedda herself was being starved, and that Hedda herself was being raped, was no matter. She herself was seen as a contradiction in terms. And how do we know this? Well, we had family data, Seattle data. This is from Seattle. Mothers who had documented histories of domestic violence. There was no mention of it in a dissolution file. And even when the fathers, domestic violence was documented in both files, there were no restrictions. He was angry at the mother, not at the children, don't you know? Even though we had seen the overlap between domestic violence and child abuse, because now we know something else. We know that it's not simply that he's hurting the mother and the child is witnessing, or the child is hurt inadvertently, or only in a rare case does he aim it at the child. What we know is that in almost every case, the children are telling us, like the Tory children or the children in this vignettes I showed you, the Magnano children, in almost every case, the children are being subjected to coercive control, at least as detailed and in as many varied ways and with as savage a consequence as the women. In England, we had this situation. 21 children, that's going to seem like very few, but in England it was enormous, who have been given by the family court in part or full to their fathers for custody, where there was evidence of domestic violence in the case, were killed by those fathers. And what we were finding was that in the welfare system, when we introduced a new definition of coercive control, there was a shift in emphasis away from victim blaming to advocacy. And Scotland was the first country to enumerate a coercive control offense that included child abuse, not exposure to children, as an aggravating factor of domestic violence, but child abuse as an element of the coercive control, bespoke offense of coercive control. This bespoke offense means that it is an offense comprised of elements, which could be crimes, would be crimes if committed separately against strangers. But when committed in the context of a domestic relationship, a partnership, take on an entirely new meaning. Stalking, for example. We know that stalking is a crime when it's committed against strangers, but stalking, 78% of all stalking takes place against partners. And we know that when stalking takes place against a partner, it's different in its duration, in the technology that's used, in the lethality that is present. It is part of the bespoke offense of coercive control. We've already talked about how violence is different when it's committed against partners. It's a serial offense. It's repeated, it's low level, but it's 1,000 times, it's 3-4 times a week, maybe every day, over months, over years. Part of a bespoke offense. Similarly, child abuse. Child abuse is not the same crime when it's committed by a stranger or it's committed in an institutional setting as it is when it's committed in a domestic situation where it's part of a coercive control context. So, and we had high profile cases. And the highest profile case was Mrs. Nicholson. I won't go through this. Many of you are familiar with Nicholson. You don't need to hear this rehashed again. But let me just remind you of the very basic details. Every one of the mothers in the Nicholson case, every one of the plaintiff mothers was herself abused. In every case of the plaintiff mother, the abuser was out of the picture. In Mrs. Nicholson's case, you remember that her son was at school, the daughter was asleep, the couple was separated, he had a protection order, he was out of state, he came into the state without her knowledge, he broke into her apartment, she served him a drink or something, hoping to placate him, and then he punched her. And he left, and he presumably went back to North Carolina from where he was from. Several hours later, the police arrived, and as you probably know, they took her children, the boy out of school when he returned from school, the sleeping girl, and they put them in foster care. Mrs. Nicholson was charged with neglect. We spent months litigating the case and researching the case. And basically, without belaboring the problem, what became apparent was that there was a policy, not a written down policy, but an effective policy of the largest child welfare system in the world. New York Child Protection System is the largest public agency in the world, not just the largest child protection agency in the world. It was an unwritten policy by the largest public agency in the world to remove children from mothers and to respond punitively to the mothers by charging them with neglect solely because they had been victims of domestic violence. No harms were ever demonstrated to any of the children in the Nicholson case. In fact, the only harms that they suffered, these children, were the results of their placement and their removal, and in placement and in foster care. The mothers had suffered no psychological harm that was ever demonstrated. The mothers were simply seen as vehicles through whom the department could leverage access to the children and control what happened to the children. They were being subjected, both the children and the mothers, to forms of indignity and to punitive interventions that we would never tolerate in our own families. And we spoke to Judge Weinstein. He allowed me to speak to him in terms of the 9th Amendment and the 13th Amendment and the 5th Amendment and other amendments. We spoke to the judge in the language of liberty and the language in rights and wrongs, not just in the legalistic language or in the language of child protection and child welfare. We spoke about the fact that these women and these children had done nothing wrong, and in fact had done everything right in most of the cases. And that the only abuse that these women were suffering and that these children were suffering primarily was from the coercive control by the child welfare system itself. And that they were using the fact that this abuse of the children was a risk in the context of domestic violence, not to protect the mothers from domestic violence, not to do something about the perpetrators. In no case were the perpetrators managed in any way, shape, or form by the child welfare system, or by the police for that matter in these cases. Although they were relatively accessible, we had no trouble getting to them. They had no trouble getting to their wives and former partners. So nothing was being done. The one arguable thing that could have protected both the women and their children, arguably, from eventual harm, and because the women were the primary targets, protecting the women would have definitely protected the children. Nothing was being done to do that. So that told us that we were dealing with child abuse not simply as an individual problem, but as a systemic problem. And you'll forgive me in this audience if I say that when the court, not simply the child welfare system, or the police, or the health system, use the child as a pretense to adopt administrative technologies or disciplinary means with the mothers that we would never stand for in another context. They are essentially committing child abuse as tangential wife abuse. My friend Marianne Hester, my colleague, describes the life we were facing with the domestic violence model before we incorporated all of this under the rubric of coercive control as life on 3 planets. We had the criminal planet in which domestic violence was being adjudicated through a revolving door of criminal charge. No one was going to jail, but it was being defined as a wrong committed by the man, and the woman was a good enough witness because she was a victim. And if she cooperated, she was treated very positively. Children were not present at all in this process. And in the child protection plan, the mother was being treated as a neglectful mother. The same mother was a cooperating victim next door in the criminal court, and men were virtually invisible in this planet, as they were in Nicholson. It was as if they didn't exist. All cases, when I went to see Child Protection Services in New York, all cases in ACS were classified under the mother's name, even if she was deceased. Men were invisible, and yet these invisible men were the ones responsible for the primary harms on the basis of which the welfare system was adjudicating the future lives of these women and children. And in the family court, God knows what was happening. These same fathers who were invisible to the child welfare system and who were the criminal defendants in the criminal court were good enough fathers so long as they hadn't hurt the children directly. And regardless of what was happening, this was assumed to be an equity proceeding. And so the mother who persisted in spewing her venom by arguing that it was not in the child's best interest to see the father without having even the remotest understanding of the extent to which the children had been coerced and controlled in the same way that she had, were being called alienating. I won't embarrass you by or insult you by dignifying the fact that so many of you have to deal with this charge of alienation syndrome in your courts, pretending it's science or there's a rubric of science. We all deal with things that we don't find pleasant in our work, so I'll skip about that. But what about the children? We were working with the myth of child abuse, which was that it was essentially a problem of family pathology rather than a criminal behavior that was widely identifiable and easily preventable if we dealt with the perpetrators. We had now, I wanted to show you this just in case. Well, we did. Oh, I don't have time. I was going to talk about Magdalena, but as one of the high-profile cases involving children, I guess I'll take a minute and I'll just talk about this. This was the Boundary case. This was the last case that was tried in England under the old definition of domestic violence. It was a case that involved probably 20 family courts, 400 social workers, 60 or 70 doctors, 30 or 40 police. This was a case in which a little boy, Daniel Paycheck, was starved to death and beaten to death by his living father. And his mother, Magdalena Luczek, was charged as a co-conspirator. And she was convicted of murder. And she was sentenced to a long prison sentence, as was he. 2 years into the sentence, on what would have been Daniel's birthday, she killed herself. There was no question that there had been domestic violence against her. But there was also no question, and her picture was paraded just like Helen Nussbaum's picture was in all the British media during the trial. And she was headlined as "Kill Him, Mom." There was no question that she was present while the boy was being starved. And I don't have time to go into details about the case and my case review of the case, but only to say this, that one of the most condemning things about her was that a week before the boy's death, she had taken him to a pediatrician, which the school had referred to, for suspicion of child abuse. She had taken him to the pediatrician's visit. The boy was emaciated. He lost half his body weight. He had scars on his body, noticeable scars. He had many of the other signs of child neglect and serious child abuse. The pediatrician looked at him, asked the boy how he was, and the boy said he was doing fine. Asked the mother how he was, the mother said he was doing fine. The pediatrician worked him up for rare blood and metabolic disorders, the kind of workup we have had done routinely with child abuse victims before Kempe published his classic work in the 70s. In other words, 50 years ago, a pediatrician might have worked up a child who presented with all the signs of abuse and neglect for rare metabolic blood disorders, but no more. Something was very wrong. And he referred to some medicines, and the child was released. Any questioning of the mother about her own abuse, any note that the pediatrician had made, and it was only after the trial and the pediatrician's testimony when I took a look at the medical notes, the pediatric notes, and I saw scrawled in pencil on the bottom of the pediatric note, "Mother's boyfriend is in the room." Did I realize that the invisible man had been hovering over this case? He had terrified the school. They hadn't reported the child abuse, the starvation. The boy had been stealing food. The boy had been doing everything possible to communicate. His father had told him not to talk about anything that was happening to him at home, at school. And so the boy had become completely silent. The teachers didn't notice that, and they could not ferret the teachers why this well-dressed mother would present this boy in the process of increasing deterioration day after day after day and then tell the teachers, don't let him eat anything except the little bit of bread and crumbs we feed him. He was stealing food at that point, communicating in every way he could that he needed help. Anyway, this case also convinced us that we needed to do something about children. We needed to get children back into the picture. And so what we see with the children is that the children are being coercively controlled, as I suggested earlier. The same strategies that are being used with the women are being used with the children. The physical violence, the intimidation, the coercion, and the control. We are getting more and more data as we begin to look that show us that children are experiencing violence in the same ways and of the same type from the same men that the mothers are experiencing. Namely, that the main forms of violence being used against the children is not bone-cracking violence, not the kind that's going to lead to medically significant injury. But they're being slapped and pushed and shoved and locked in the closet. And we're getting this from all kinds of sources. We're getting this from pediatric records, we're getting this from court records, family court records. This is the work of Beck and Ragavan, which I guess many of you have seen. But what Beck and Ragavan do is they use the new perspective of coercive control and they test it against the old perspective of domestic violence. And they show that when you look at coercive control, you can predict 80% of the escalating violence, 80% of the threats to life of the children. Whereas domestic violence itself only accounts for 20%. And when you looked at the fear in mediation, it was almost always because there was coercive control. They were taking their money, limiting their food intake, restricting their movement. I'm not talking about psychological abuse now, although psychological abuse is part of coercive control. What we're talking about is objective constraints and deprivations related to life and liberty and hope. Taking of your social comfort, intruding in your attempts to go to sleep, following you around the house, monitoring your time in the bathroom, all of the things, making, staying and complying and obeying, rather than saying no or refusing. Those things we associate with dictators appear the safest and only viable option. So that children and women make choices. They decide to stay, they decide to comply, they decide to obey, not because they've come to an agreement in mediation that makes their counselors happy, but because if they're in the context of coercion and control, that is the safest and the only viable option they see. The first case that New York had on their new family court rule that they should respect the wishes of the child rather than the best interest of the child was a case in which a young girl found her mother dead on New Year's Eve. The father who lived down the hall was the obvious killer. The obvious killer. He had been abusing her for some time. He wanted to get things on with the girlfriend, and she had threatened to divorce him and cut him off from the money which he needed for his gambling habits. She found the mother dead, and she was traumatized. Of course she would be. And she was terrified of her father, what would happen to her. And the aunt and uncle hired me because she had expressed the desire, which the lawyer, the family lawyer, had an obligation under the new state law to represent. She had expressed, Anna Kaufman had expressed a desire to be with her father. And the aunt and uncle wanted me to oppose that. They say how terrible it is for this girl to want to be with her father, how dangerous it is. He killed her mother already, and she's the only witness, really, and he's going to go on trial. He was out on bail. He's going to go up on trial for murder. He's going to take it out on her. And of course, I suspected that was so. But on the other hand, I had an obligation to respect her wishes. What was going on, not looking at domestic violence and psychological trauma, but from the perspective of the coercive control of children, that made her identify her best option as complying with him, as going along. She had experienced a very classic case of Stockholm Syndrome, as it turned out, where she had identified complying with his wishes as the only, and doing agreeably what he wanted as the only safe thing. If she had gone with her aunt and uncle as they wished, she would have been terrified. I said, of course, you have to respect. I had to respect what she wanted. But I had to also make clear to the family court why she said what she wanted, why her options had been so severely constrained. The only safe choice she thought she could make was a choice to be with her father. As it turned out, he copped a plea and she was able to go with her aunt and uncle. It worked out all right. But what makes a battered child is not, just as what makes a battered woman, it's not the physical bruises on their arms and legs, but the subordination and exploitation and constructed inability to refuse, resist, or escape demands that compromise their safety and well-being. What made Anna Kaufman a battered child in that case was the fact that she was being coerced and controlled under the court's eyes. And that this history of coercive control that he'd exercised over her mother through all these years and over the two children over all these years was evident, could easily have been ferreted out. And had he been arrested, as he would be today, in Scotland or England or Ireland or Taiwan or any one of a number of other places for coercive control, all of this would have been avoided. So witnessing in the context of coercive control is explained as a controlled participant. A child is made to witness. He may choose to witness, she may choose to witness. The mother may choose to have the child witness. A mother told me she was aware that a child was witnessing when she was being raped by her partner, but she wanted the girl to remember that when she grew up. Now that may sound like a horrible thing to a court to subject that to a girl, but think of the alternative, which is the girl lying as the Tory brothers did in their beds at night, listening to the sounds and the screams and imagining what the children conjure is worse than what they were experiencing. Witnessing it is an assigned role. Boys and girls respond differently to resistance, to witnessing. But witnessing is also a strategy. Children have told me that they witness deliberately. They make witnessing part of calming the situation, that they make witnessing part of letting their mother know that there's something out there for them. Child sexual abuse, again, something that we have swept as a separate problem committed by perverts in a strange world. That's not what the data show us. And either you want to realize this in the family court situation or you don't, but it's what's out there. Incest, almost only takes place 75%, 73, 75% of the time, incest takes place in the context of ongoing coercive control. In 40% of the cases, almost 40% of the cases now, in one comparative study, we're finding that children are sexually abused as well as their mothers, and they are being sexually abused by the same men who are abusing and sexually abusing their wives. That these two things are occurring together. And that they are being repeated. That sexual abuse does not take place necessarily as rape, but takes place as seduction and grooming and touching and following. And these guys are many, many more. So, and the sexual abuse of man is not the psychotic pervert. He is the control freak who tests psychologically normal, wears a suit and tie to the courtroom, had a fine family attorney, but is into domination and control in his personal life and translates that into sexual dominance. It's not necessarily a sexual instinct at all, or it may be in some cases. The surveillance that we're seeing in children is very much like the surveillance we're seeing with adults, except that, of course, it tends to involve pets more frequently. I made the dog disappear, just as I can make mommy disappear. You want to find, I had one murder case in Connecticut where the only physical violence had been one incident of abuse before she killed the husband. There had been virtually no physical abuse, but he told the boy again and again and again, if you want to find mommy, she'll be outside in the backyard buried next to the dog, where he killed the kid's pet. And he was showing things. Increasingly, youngsters as young as 8 are telling us that their fathers are making them wear monitors, keeping in touch with them throughout the day during school, having them check in, having them surveil and track their mothers. There's all kinds of ways in which children are being frightened and intimidated into colluding with the batterer, but also just in terms of regulating their own behavior. Exaggerating punishment is one of the most extreme forms of intimidation. So he does something extreme, he breaks something, or he punishes the child. In one case I had, he came into our room and he broke all of her records the first time that her music was playing too loud. She never let herself go out of that room again when there was domestic violence going on. Weaponizing the children, we don't have time to go into these, but just to really spell out that what we are finding are children are telling us, children as young as 3, are telling us they are being confined. Their fathers are going on search and destroy missions through their rooms, through their books, through their diaries, through their cell phones, through their video games, through their computer histories, through their clothes closets. That they were being humiliated and degraded in the same way and with the same purpose, to isolate them and silence them, as is being done with the mothers. It's just that we don't see it as silencing with children, we see it as discipline. We don't see it as the violation of privacy rights in children. We see it as appropriating the knowledge we need in order to keep an eye on our kids. And God knows, as a grandfather and father of 4, you know, I can plead guilty to many of these violations. I mean, I remember my wife once ripping the phone out of the 3rd floor, our son's 3rd floor bedroom, and throwing it out the window. I mean, what a more gross violation of privacy, because he was talking too long on the phone. And she is an absolute goddess of sanity. Alienating the children from the mother, systematic alienation. I'm not talking about bad-mouthing the mother. I'm talking about telling the child that if he talks to the mother, In one case, the child was forbidden to talk to the mother for 2 years because the child had spoken up at the dinner table when the father said something to the mother the child didn't like. For 2 years, there was silence. So it's not just punishment of children we're talking about. We're talking about the use of extreme punishment that shocks a child into not knowing where they can move. And there's so many examples we can give on this. Emma Katz writes, perpetrator's father's coercive control. Emma Katz is a British psychologist who studies coercive control of children and works with children directly, one of the leading authorities on this field. Coercive control prevented children from spending time with their mothers and grandparents, visiting other children's houses, and engaging in extracurricular activity. These nonviolent behaviors place children in isolated, disempowering, and constrained worlds. What does it mean? If we don't think children have rights and needs of their own, if we don't think women have rights and needs of their own, God help us when it comes to children. Do children have a right not to be disempowered, not to be isolated, or just is it that they shouldn't be physically hurt? Not to be living in constrained worlds, which could hamper their resilience and development and contribute. He was everywhere, one of my clients told me. We turned up. He was at my son's basketball club. And he was upsetting the children, embarrassing them too. I could see Luke was embarrassed. He felt awkward and he felt guilty towards me. I was visibly upset. He was very clever. There were interdicts in place that he couldn't verbally abuse me, but he would just say a few words that meant something to me, but meaningless to other people. And that would set me off. In this case, what happened is he showed up at the son's karate tournament. And she was told that she wasn't to have physical contact with him. So when he came up to her inebriated, he left his girlfriend and he came up to her as they were leaving the gym. She tried to leave. He pushed her down. She called the police, as she was supposed to do according to her lawyer, and report it and not make any other contact. And because she had called the police and overreacted, the entire case was reversed, and he ended up being given custody by the family court. The battered mother's dilemma is always created by the offending partner forcing her to choose between her own safety and her child's safety. This is the classic situation in which women are forced to make decisions that no one should be forced to make and held accountable for it. Like I said, although Heather Nussbaum was herself bound and gagged and raped when the police came in and found the girl killed, the girl had been starved to death and bound, they charged her and only dropped the charges because she was willing to give evidence against him. And she was excoriated. This is the battered mother's dilemma. If I do what the court wants, I put myself and my child at risk. If I don't, I lose my child. If I deliver him to custody, even though I know there's coercive control going on, and there's no way you can know unless the lawyers tell you, and there's no way the lawyers know unless the advocates tell the lawyers, and there's no way the advocates know unless we have a framework within which we're training advocates and lawyers and judges to be sensitized, and there's no way we can sensitize them properly unless we allow the children's voices to be heard in court, in counseling sessions, in schools, wherever children appear with their friends online. We have numerous websites and numerous chat groups throughout Europe where children talk and they're monitored, but they're not interrupted, where they talk about the coercive control with each other that they're experiencing in their family. And the Girl Guides, their equivalent to the Girl Scouts, have adopted coercive control as a merit badge. And there are hundreds of these projects going on in local communities where kids are talking to each other about coercion and control in a relationship, children are facing the same dilemmas their mothers are facing, to choose between their own safety and their children's safety and well-being. Children are being used as weapons and pawns and tools. Are we looking at parental alienation syndrome? Not in any of the cases I was involved in Virginia. Not in any of the cases I've been involved in so far. Every single one of the cases where the psychologist has alleged PAS or some lawyer has alleged it has turned out to be a situation in which there's coerced control of the mother and child. Some of you in the DC circuit may even remember this case where the mother moved to be in the Clinton administration and the husband, and works in the Commerce Department, and the husband claimed PAS and was given custody, and her visitation was limited, and what's his face, the PAS score was still alive, and he testified in favor of the father, PAS. And the boy, as a teenager whom I interviewed, I remember, had cut his crosses in his arm. He was so heavily alienated. He'd been so heavily controlled by the father. The mother had been in Indiana, so there hadn't been any violence in the relationship for a number of years. And the courts were completely stymied about how could this guy, as the mother claimed, be exercising terrifying control over her. And he was doing it because he had weaponized the son. And he had terrified the son. And the phone call, when the phone rang, the son would shake. In my office, the son began to shake, and I knew where the fear was coming from. So we have to start reframing child harms. Instead of witnessing an exposure to domestic violence, we have to start talking about children experiencing coercive control and attend to children's agency in this situation. How do the children perceive it? What are the children experiencing? I don't mean how do they perceive it necessarily giving us oral testimony. I mean learning by what the children do, what the games they play, how let a child psychologist or somebody talk to the child and tell us what's going on. Stop talking about children as collateral damage in domestic violence and start recognizing that they're secondary victims. And again, I don't mean secondary in importance. The important thing about learning that they're secondary victims is only that we understand that the man does not consider how he is harming the child when he does what he does to the child. He considers only how it intensifies his control over the primary object of his control, the woman, and his control over the resources in the family. So he can hurt the child far more seriously than he intends, and may be shocked at the consequences of what he does. When we see a vulnerable, depressed mother, we must rule out. It doesn't mean they don't exist. People are depressed and do all kinds of crazy, stupid, eccentric things, men and women. But when we see it in a case involving custody, and our first priority is to rule out coercive control, we should consider the illegitimate exercise of male power first. Rule that out before we move on. Is the child free to speak? Is the woman free to speak? Are rights being recognized? And can they have a voice in our courtroom? Failure to protect. What is it? Control in the context of no control. When the pediatrician in the Luchak case saw that he was in the room, he got scared. And he resorted to a metabolic workup, rather than to exercise the common sense that any pediatrician in first-year medical school would do with a child who presented the classic signs of child abuse, namely report that case. He could have done it in all kinds of positive ways. He could have asked to leave the room for a minute, made a phone call. He could have asked for a follow-up appointment the next day. Instead, he gave the mother a referral for 2 weeks from then and gave her some aspirin. And then she was charged with not bringing the boy forward. Even though she brought the boy forward, the way I knew she was presenting him, frankly, with the boy's abuse was that she spoke in English. Marius didn't speak English, she only spoke Polish. And so when the mother addressed the pediatrician, she gave Marius the explanation that she was doing it because that was what the pediatrician understood. And she was afraid, of course, for herself because she was being starved, and she was tied up, and she was being beaten and sexually abused and coming to school with all the makeup on, cakes on, and so forth. But what you had her doing was control in the context of no control. So this is your violence model. There's an episode, there's an incident. That's not what's happening. Abuse in this case, in these cases, in 70 to 80% of the cases where we see domestic violence, abuse is continuous. And it is consisting of minor pushes, slaps, shoves. Sure, they're punctuated by more severe incidents. In 25% of the cases of coercive control, there is no physical violence at all that we see. 25% of the cases, the psychological abuse is sufficient. The monitoring is sufficient. The stalking is sufficient. The terrorism is sufficient. The intimidation is sufficient. The degradation is sufficient to establish all of the grounds of control he needs. He doesn't need to use physical violence. Not that it's done out of a sense of need, but it may not happen. So not only are your domestic violence cases going to be coercive control, but some of the most dangerous cases are the cases where the violence only begins after the dominance is established and he can have his way with her. Instead of injury, we have to understand that our dangerous assessments have to be looked at in terms of multiple tactics. And we have to be concerned with the cumulative harms over time, the aggregate degradation, the aggregate powerlessness, the aggregate sense of inefficacy that makes it impossible for a woman, even when she's living separately, to protect herself. So that when Sally Challen looked in the mirror and tried to retrieve her own voice that she had lost over the years of dominance in relationship with her husband, she could only hear his voice telling her what to do. She couldn't brush her teeth without permission. She was afraid to pick up the hairbrush. She was afraid to not wash her face in a certain way, not to get the coffee on the table in a certain order. And when the court heard that, the conscience of the court was shocked. Her leadership, despite all of the legal restrictions placed on the High Court of England and the limits of the criminal court, which are enormous in England compared to the United States in terms of the types of evidence they can entertain. Nevertheless, in that courtroom of 500 or 600 people, when I finished describing what had happened to Sally Challen, there was not a person who didn't know that liberty was coming through the door. It was funny, speaking of liberty coming through the door, when I was, the day before they introduced the new coercive control law in Ireland, I was meeting with all the chiefs of police, chiefs of detectives, and what have you. They wanted some advice on how to implement this new offense. And I wasn't saying anything, and the chief of detectives pointed to me and said, "Doctor, what do you want me to do? A man is running down the street with a television set. You want me to tell my officer, let him run with the television set, go respond to a domestic? What can I tell my officer?" And the woman who's deputy chief of police, Mary O'Shaughnessy in Ireland, stood up. She's about 5'6". She stood up and she looked at the guy, the detective across the table. She said, "I'll tell you what you tell him. You tell him He's bringing liberty through the door. So there's a change in the criminal side. And the change in the criminal side is important because it says we take seriously something. And it says that these three planets all are part of the same universe, that they're accountable and responsible to the same set of children and women and adults, albeit that we divide them piecemeal into different jurisdictions. We have to understand that the calculus of harms we're looking at, it's not whether someone is physically hurt, but whether they're free to voice their being as children and can do that in a way that allows them to become persons, whether they're poor or rich or black or Native American or Hispanic, that they should have a right to not be entrapped. And to look at the duration of this thing that is going on. This is an entrapment crime on a par with the kidnapping and any kind of bondage crime. It's not a violence crime. It's not an assault crime in any matter of speaking. And I want to say also to you in family court particularly, this is not a family problem. This is not about intimate relations. There is no case of coercive control, let me assure you. There is no case of coercive control which does not involve the workplace, which does not involve the neighbors, which does not involve the sibs, which does not involve the school, which does not involve the daycare, which does not involve the shopping mart. These rules which these men exercise, the surveillance which they use and extends through social space, and they have the modern means and the technology to do that. And safety, while it remains an important concern for children, we want our children to be safe. But for mothers, and for fathers too, some, and for children in particular, it is dignity and liberty and autonomy that we want. And the children are incredibly active. Another reason we don't want to use terms like witnessing. And we don't want to use terms like exposed to abuse anymore. It's because every child I talk to, even the youngest who can speak, and we suspect we're seeing this even with infant reactions in the crib, is coping in some way. Crying coping, screaming coping, moving coping, restless coping. But it's much more active, and their systems are much more astute and acute at all phases than the passive ideas suggest. The types, the good girl, the bad girl, the identification with the aggressor, knock-me-knock, quick case. Knock-me-knock was a case in which I had a 5-volume diary on my side to represent the mother in the divorce case. They both were at Sikorsky Aircraft in Stratford. I had a 5-volume diary. The only problem was the diary was in Chinese, and we couldn't afford to translate it. He had never physically beaten her. He slapped her, he pushed her, he shoved her. There was plenty of evidence of that. And he admitted doing that once or twice, but there was no other evidence of control. And she had come into shelter and she went through a long history of abuse, physical abuse, control, everything like that. We had no way of knowing. And she told the people at the shelter, she told the women at the shelter all about the history. And I hope Kit doesn't get mad at me about this. She told her I had the whole history documented. And we put the shelter worker on the stand and she presented the history. But then it came time for the cross-examination, and the lawyer for the husband asked her, is that shelter record complete? And the shelter worker had to admit that no, she had torn out 2 pages from the shelter record that she thought were harmful to her client. And the record as a whole was thrown out by the judge. And so when I testified, I took those 2 pages. Because on those 2 pages, Mariah Knock, the 9-year-old girl, had pointed to her mother in the middle of the shelter where her mother was talking. During, I don't know why she was present, but apparently she was in the room. And she pointed to her mother and she said, "I hope you die. I hope you die." And I presented this to the court. And the lawyer for the father jumped up and said, "Doctor, isn't that positive evidence that the child wants to be with the father, that the child is alienated from the mother?" But the judge, fortunately, who had heard my testimony about coercive control in the abstract, I couldn't testify about my client specifically, understood that this process of identifying with the aggressor was the result of Mariah Knock being coercively controlled by the child. And while the judge hadn't been impressed by the abuse that had occurred to Mrs. Knock because it wasn't well documented, she was very impressed by the idea of this well-spoken, perfectly performing child at school with perfect grades, perfectly well presented, nevertheless had broken down and espoused hatred for her mother in the context of this. The children are always resistant. They'll always do it. There, I did have Mariah Knock. I think that's all I have to say. I will stop there.
Perfect timing, actually, Dr. Stark. Thank you so much. That was an incredible presentation. And I'm just going to let everyone know we're going to take a 10-minute break and come back just 2 minutes, I guess, after noon. And then I'll introduce and we'll hear from Kit Gruelle, who is an amazing advocate. I'll introduce her in a few minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I am going to introduce Kit Gruelle, who is a survivor of domestic violence who has worked as an advocate for battered women and their children for more than 30 years. She has shared her extensive expertise through trainings about the complexities and dynamics of family violence to advocates and healthcare providers, clergy, legislators, and educators, as well as first responders, public safety dispatchers, and hostage and crisis negotiators. She's served as an expert witness in state and federal courts, and she plays a central role in the film Private Violence, which is an incredibly compelling documentary on domestic abuse, which premiered at the 2014 Sundance Film Festival and is now available on Amazon Prime. I cannot recommend it highly enough. You'll see a couple of scenes from it during her presentation today. It has been a great personal and professional privilege for me to work closely with Kit over many years. I'm thrilled that you all will have the opportunity to learn from her as I have done. And now I am going to share my screen and her PowerPoint. Okay, Kit, do you see your?
I do.
On the screen? Okay, I am ready when you are. Just tell me when to forward the slides.
Okay, and can you hear me all right, Deborah?
Yes.
I'm assuming everybody else can as well. Okay, well, good early afternoon, everyone. Evan and I both appreciate this opportunity to talk with you all about what I call the unarrestable offenses of domestic abuse. And I do not use the term domestic violence anymore for precisely the reasons that Evan has talked about. I think if we focus solely on physical abuse, we're missing about 90% of what we need to be paying attention to. So that's part of what I'm going to be talking about in the next few minutes with you all. Okay, Deborah, can you advance the slide? So, as Deborah said, I work with law enforcement a lot. For the last 22 years, excuse me, I've been co-facilitating a class out in California for hostage negotiators or crisis negotiators, because domestic abuse is the central issue around 60 to 80% of all hostage and barricade incidents every year in America. And the state of California kind of looked at it and said, okay, we need to rethink what we're doing when we go to these call outs. So, so it's been an honor and a privilege to be involved with them. I actually started with Post back in 1997. And what got me so intrigued by what Post was doing was they just took this very clear and kind of compelling approach to dealing with domestic abuse. And one of the first things that they did was create training films. And what you're about to see, this short clip that's called the Post Domestic Violence Intro, is still used today, even though it was made in 1996. It's very powerful. As you watch this, I'd like for you to listen for examples of coercive control because it's there. The threat of physical and or violence is coercion. Abusers only need to be physically abusive once to get the point across. Cultural considerations must be considered. And I want to give you all a trigger warning because these are actual 911 calls. They're photographs of women who have been abused. And I also want to warn you that the opening scene contains a message that was left on an answering machine. And it contains language. So I just want to make sure that everybody has a heads up. We'll play it and then I'll proceed, but please have your antenna up for anything that could be construed as coercive behavior in these in this tape. Okay, Deborah. We need volume. Can we get the volume up?
Deborah, you may need to.
I'm so sorry. You would think I would be used to this by now. Here we go.
You may need to reshare it.
Oh. Can you not see it now?
Yeah, I can see it and hear it.
Kyle?
Yes, it is working now. Sorry about that.
Okay, here we go.
You want to step up a notch? I'll fucking make your life miserable. You want to fucking play games? I'll fucking play games. Fuck, call my mom and fucking do that shit? Call your mom and dad. I'll fucking fuck them up too. I have nothing to lose, baby. Think about Cali, baby. Dead. You'll fucking find yourself in a goddamn grave. You want to play big games with me.
Sending emergency. My mommy is having a fight. Is she hitting her? Stop it! Mommy! Stop it! Don't take the baby! Stop it! You're gonna hurt the baby! Stop it! Could you just send the police, please? Okay, we're gonna be there. We're taking your baby. Mommy, please! 911 emergency room? How's an emergency? What's the emergency there? It's the domestic abuse. Is he white, black, Hispanic, Oriental? He's white. He's law enforcement. He probably has... Wait a minute. What do you mean law enforcement? What is he? Patrol. He's got a restraining order against him. He was just inside my house, and he hit me when he was in. I heard that, yes. Did you hear him slap me? Yes, I did. Thank you. Please, okay. My kids are freaking out. 911 emergency light. Please, help me. What happened? He brought it in the grave. Please help me. He's gonna break the door. Please. Okay, what happened? Please have to move. All right, send the police. What you need? 911 San Francisco emergency. My husband's outside with the gun and he's threatening to kill my parents. All right, listen to me. Oh, God, no, he's coming in to get us. All right, I'm getting the police right over there. They're on their way now. Okay. Okay, is the door locked? No. Is he in the garage? Yeah, he's in the house now. What is he doing? He's standing right here right next to me with the gun.
Domestic Domestic violence is the #1 preventable crime that law enforcement responds to.
This victim or this family may not have anyone to turn to, and you've got to do your job.
Deal with it now, or we can deal with it later. But at some point, we're going to have to deal with with the violence that's happening in this family.
So since we're unable to kind of communicate back and forth, I just want to point out to everyone that when I first saw that, I was at a DA's conference in Atlanta in 1996. And the thing that leapt off the screen for me is that if we went back to that, every one of those murder-suicides was committed by the estranged husband or the estranged boyfriend. So we still have a bad habit in this country of saying to victims of domestic abuse, well, you just need to leave. And I hope by now everybody understands that that is the most dangerous thing that victims of domestic abuse can do. So I just wanted to point that out. So we are in America. I haven't been around the world like Evan has, but I know in this country, we're kind of trained to look for the obvious and visible signs of domestic abuse. So black eyes, broken noses, like the photographs that we saw of those women in that intro video. But what I have learned over the last 30 plus years from working with domestic violence victims, and I recently had to estimate how many victims it's been, and it's been around 40,000 women, that similar to what Evan said, what's the most paralyzing to them is not the physical abuse, because law enforcement will respond to physical abuse. Neighbors will respond to physical abuse, other family members, whatever. But when she tries to articulate the acts of coercive control he's employing with her, oftentimes what people say is, well, is he hitting you? And so that just minimizes it for her even further. So the physical abuse, I call the punctuation mark to all the other tactics that the abuser is using. And I use the term tactics because I spend so much time with law enforcement that I sometimes see things through a kind of a law enforcement lens. But abusers don't start out being physically abusive. They start out with controlling behaviors. And the ways in which we're socialized as women is we're socialized to be compliant and to be to want to please and that sort of thing. So before we know it, we're in this situation, and then he starts to test the victim, and this is part of what happens. So the object of the exercise for the abuser is to first gain control and then to maintain that control. Any and all tactics are acceptable, and the abuse in his mind is justified. So my dead abusive husband, I'm not going to go into it. If you watch the film, you'll see it. But one of the things that he expected me to do was wash salt off of the peanuts that he had every night before he left to go to town. He was a weightlifter, and he was trying to gain muscle weight. So he wanted high amounts of protein in his food, but he didn't want salt on the peanuts that I put on his ice cream. So when I first told that story that I had to wash the salt off the peanuts, California code for mental health call is 5150. And they would think, well, this is just insane. What woman is going to say to a cop, this all happened because I didn't wash the salt off the peanuts? What I'm saying to you all is I want you to sort of broaden your aperture. And when a victim says something to you that just doesn't seem like it makes any sense, please continue to listen and help her to explain the context to you, because what she is talking about with you probably is exactly what's happening. And it's critical to what can happen in any court setting, whether it's civil, criminal, family, whatever. So we have to see the whole picture. The abuser will use coercive tactics with anyone and everyone, especially those in the court system, to remain in control. Coercion is most often quite subtle. Okay, Deborah, can you advance this? So in domestic abuse relationships, context is virtually everything. Coercive control happens in private. The abuser, gets to the point where all he has to do is give her a particular look, give the children a particular look, and they know exactly what that look means. So I have two cases here. One of the officers that I worked with, Mike Agnew, ran the domestic violence division in Fresno. And he was telling me about a case that his officers went to investigate. And when they went in the house, there was a nail hanging from the wall and a belt was hanging on the on this nail. And the mom and the children reported to law enforcement and to CPS that all the dad had to do while he was sitting in his chair right next to where this belt was hanging was just glance up at the belt, and they knew exactly what that meant. So he had them literally under his thumb with only having to posture, with only having to glance up at this belt that was hanging on the wall. Now, there's another case here that we used in the negotiations class involving David Brain, who was the police chief of Tacoma, Washington. David Brain was horrifically abusive with his wife, Crystal, but she was married to the police chief, so she was not going to pick up the phone and call 911. She filed for divorce on a Monday. The following Saturday, when they were exchanging their small children in a grocery store parking lot, she, in the divorce papers that she had filed, there were allegations of the domestic abuse. So on that Saturday, David Brain pulled out his service weapon and shot Crystal in the head, and then turned the gun on himself and killed himself in front of the children. And as you can imagine, there was this huge, big, how did this happen? He was the police chief. What did we miss? And there was a big investigation. And when I was reading it as an advocate, what stood out to me was not the obvious stuff. The thing that made me realize how much danger she was facing was every morning when she got up, she had to walk into the bathroom, and with David Brain standing there, stand on the scale and weigh the exact same thing. So what that says to me is that he had that much control over her life. And when a woman who is being that intensely controlled, or a woman and children who are being that intensely controlled, when they basically say to themselves and everyone else, we're done, we can't live like this anymore. This is when the murders and the murder-suicides, and now unfortunately the mass murders happen. So I believe, I'm not a researcher like Evan is, but I believe there's a direct correlation between this degree of what I call the minutia, the intense control, and the risk for extreme violence when the woman says, I've got to get out of here. Okay, Deborah, can you advance the slide, please? So this is David Brain. He looks like, an all-American police chief, but what was going on behind closed doors was wretchedly abusive and controlling, lots and lots and lots of coercive control, to say nothing of the fact that he was a police chief. So we have to get over sometimes the stereotyping that we do, where we think that domestic violence happens in a particular part of town or with a particular group or groups of people, and I'm going to talk about that more in a little bit. Okay, Deborah, can you advance the slide, please? So coercive control happens every day in family and DV court, both criminal and civil. Witness intimidation is the most under-recognized and underreported crime that happens in front of criminal justice professionals. So there is coded language, behaviors, and tactics that the abuser and the victims are fully aware of, but that everybody else might miss. A good friend of mine who was a DV cop out in San Francisco, Tom Walsh, he and I just talked last week, and he told me about a case that he and his partner wound up investigating, where a woman called 911 freaking out and screaming, he's playing on the wings of a dove, he's playing on the wings of a dove. Well, again, this is why context counts. On the wings of a dove, to her, meant that she was about to get beaten, that she was about to be abused. And to a lot of people, they might say, well, so what? It's just a song. Again, this is a way that we have to understand and can recognize that the victims are the ones that they're the experts. They're the ones that have the information that we really need to listen to. So I just suggest and hope that you'll do that. The hand towel is another Tom and Jeff story. So they went out together to investigate a domestic violence case. And Tom's partner, Jeff, almost always worked with the victims because he just had a way of getting victims to calm down and open up, whereas Tom was kind of the, you know, the more intense guy, and he would work with the suspects. So Jeff had the victim way away from the suspect, and Tom had talked to the suspect, and he told Tom that he needed to use the bathroom. So he used the bathroom, and he walked out with a hand towel in his hand. And she glanced over Jeff's shoulder and saw this hand towel and immediately started to shake and immediately got very frightened. And Jeff was smart enough to realize that something had just happened. So he took her outside and he said, help me understand what was going on there. And once he got her calmed down again, she explained to him that every time he assaulted her, he put a hand towel over her face and would beat her. And so here was this coded thing that went on just between the two of them. And if Jeff hadn't have been the astute law enforcement officer that he was, he might not have even picked up on that. And so that's a story of the hand towel. And I just think that it's so important for us to recognize this coded language, behavior, and tactics. And then when I was talking with Tom last week about this, he said that very early on, he just learned that that domestic abuse is so much more than a physical assault. Okay. Officers, judges, and magistrates and other criminal justice professionals are manipulated by abusers all the time. So we're going to see a clip in just a minute that will demonstrate this, but I'm going to go through the slide first. So you'll see this suspect, offender, defendant in custody in handcuffs, and you can see him manipulating the judge, which he very effectively does. The abuser wants to remain out of custody so that he can continue to control, manipulate, and coerce the victims. Our aperture must be widened to be cognizant of coercive tactics being employed by the abuser because they're there. Okay. So in a minute, we're going to see this. We're going to see this clip from Private Violence. Pay attention to what this suspect does with the judge. And then I want you to notice how in just a nanosecond, he manages to intimidate the victim. Okay, Deborah, go ahead and play that if you can.
So it's kind of busy today.
It is. This is an extremely busy day.
They're bringing the guy over from jail.
That's this one.
Is that for a restraining order violation?
He was arrested for the same incident that she took out the DVP.
Oh,
Yes, sir. I met with the DA's office on the security report. Thank you. And we'll come back to this matter shortly. Thank you for your patience in that regard. When that completes the call of our civil calendar, is there anybody?
So I'm just trying to explain to her what may happen today.
What do you want to have happen?
I just want him to stay away from me. That's all. He gets out today, so I just want him to stay away from me.
Did he get picked up on Friday?
No, he got picked up the week before Thursday, March 1st.
Does he have a long history?
Oh yeah, he's a felon, a big felon. This is his third offense, assaulting a female.
With you or with other women?
Other women.
So, and just with her case, there were 3 or 4 felony charges.
Do you have family close by?
Yeah.
So you feel, when you're at home, you feel like you're pretty safe?
No.
He's got a lot of friends who worries more who
he's going to get other people to ask because his cousin lives less than a mile from me.
Does the judge know all this?
No, she hasn't had a chance to talk to him yet.
Make sure that he knows all this stuff because there's, the restraining order is supposed to say no third party contact too. So, and this sounds fairly serious. Don't be afraid to say anything. It's not your job to fix broken men.
Tell me about it.
A lot of us think that it is, but it's not. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
It's nice to meet you.
Thank you. You too.
All right, we're here today to address the matter of a civil restraining order that would bar you from having any contact. What would you like to do? Would you like a moment to talk to Ms. Kennebrew?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Yes, ma'am?
It was a concern of Ms. Morgan's that that no third party contact be allowed and that be.
That would be the condition of a DVPO.
So for him, it was mission accomplished. He was in custody. He had handcuffs on. He was surrounded by criminal justice, law enforcement professionals, the judge, everybody, but he was able to do exactly what he wanted to do without anybody really noticing. He was yes sir, no sir with the judge. The judge told him no third party contact, but when he stopped and turned around and shot that look at the victim and made eye contact with her for a nanosecond, he accomplished exactly what he wanted to. And I promise you this is going on in the cases that you all are working on all the time. So I just ask you to be mindful of these acts of coercion and approach your work accordingly. Again, the victims are the ones who are the true experts in what he's capable of. I have a stack of restraining orders from North Carolina, and I probably got 50 or 60 restraining orders. And in these restraining orders, all the women committed to their ex parte order, to their complaint motion, what the abuser was capable of doing. And all these restraining orders, the women were killed in the exact same way they said they were going to be. So if we start to listen to victims and treat them like the experts that they are, I think we can prevent a lot of the really awful things that are happening. So society tends to stereotype domestic violence abusers and victims, but abuse, intimidation, and coercion happens across the entire socioeconomic spectrum. Abusers with social, political, and economic power use their status to maintain control over the victims. Having a well-cultivated public persona that's the opposite of his private persona. So if he is a bank president, or he is a pastor, or he is whatever, society has their mind made up about who they think he is, which makes it that much more difficult for her when she does step out of the shadows, because everyone thinks that they know him. And if there is something going on, then it must be something to do with her and her inability to be a good partner. So that's the kind of thing that we hear and see all the time. And I would ask you all to think about the domestic violence murders and murder-suicides that have happened in and around the DC area. What almost always happens is out goes the TV crew and they find a neighbor, and almost invariably the neighbor says, but he seemed like such a nice guy, which tells us that this dual personality tactic is well honed. And he wants everybody on the outside to see him as a nice guy, because again, that makes it that much more difficult for her. So in just a second, we're going to show a clip of it's a recording that was made by the daughter of a doctor down in Alabama who was wretchedly, coercively controlling, violent, abusive, you name it, everything on the entire power and control wheel and beyond. But he was a doctor. So when the mom finally said, we can't live like this anymore, and went to get this order of protection, the female judge who was hearing the case looked at her and said, well, he's a doctor, you must have a big house. I'm going to order that you let him return to the home. And I'm just going to tell him he has to sleep in a different bedroom. So that evening when he came home, he attacked his wife and children. And luckily, one of his daughters had her cell phone in her hand, and she turned on the cell phone and made this recording. So I think that's coming up next. Deborah, can we go ahead and play that? Yeah, we've gone through this.
Okay.
You don't understand, I'm not over it. I'm not over y'all coming down there and acting like you're gonna testify against me. I'm not over that shit. I can't understand why my daughters would go against me. Don't ever go against me! You understand what I'm saying? Fucking go against me. Never! Don't! Fucking go against me. Don't ever go against me. You understand what I'm saying? I can't forget you are my daughters. God damn it, I'd never do that to my dad. What's wrong with y'all? Now, am I a person that you fuck with? I mean, seriously. I mean, look at me. Just look at my face. Is that a motherfucker that you fuck? Is that a fucker that you fuck with? Is it? Who's gonna take care of it? Who's gonna fucking provide? Who's the son of a bitch that stands in front of the fucking monster and keeps them from raping y'all?
I get calls from battered women all over the country and emails, and this one happens to be from a woman who's married to a doctor, a very prominent physician. And they made this tape not long after there was a restraining order hearing, but the female judge who knew that he was a doctor said, just let him come home. Your house is big enough for both of you. And so it's just so frustrating because we don't know what's going on in these gated communities, in these expensive homes, until something like this happens. So I tore this up. I tore this up because I was so angry about it. It's a rough draft of a paper that I turned in recently, and the professor wrote a note across the bottom, so it made me mad and I tore it up. Now I'm going to put it back together again. Hit a very interesting discussion. I have two recommendations. First, you say in the beginning that domestic violence, quote, touches all socioeconomic groups. I am not an expert in this field, but my impression is that domestic violence is more common among poor, less educated people. Most middle-class persons, such as doctors, lawyers, and professors, etc., do not beat their wives and children. Nice. Nice. But I'm going to save this because this is a reminder to me that we have a long, long, long way to go.
Oops. Is that?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
No. Okay, there we go. So you've seen 3 film clips now, and coercive control was a part of all of them. Sometimes it was 1-on-1 or 1-on-2 or 3. Sometimes it was happening right there, you know, as we say here in the South, in front of God and everybody, in the courtroom. And it does happen in where you work, in your courtroom. If you're law enforcement officers, it happens when you roll up on the scene. There's nothing that an abuser wants more than to get law enforcement on his side. I do want to stop here and say that I do know that sometimes it's, you know, a male victim and a female offender. It also happens in gay and lesbian relationships, so I don't want to dismiss that at all. But still, primarily, when we're talking about domestic abuse, domestic violence, coercive control, we're talking about a very bad power dynamic between men and women, and we're still missing it. I'm thrilled that Evan's work it has sort of taken off like it has. I couldn't agree more that if we focus solely on the physical abuse, that we are missing the most important parts of the power imbalance in this relationship. So if you become familiar with acts of coercion that are happening right under your nose, criminal justice professionals that interact with the abuser can intervene in appropriate ways to both mitigate and stop the coercion. Everyone should remain mindful of the potential consequences the victim faces for speaking up. It's dangerous. It's dangerous. A lot of women stay because they'd rather stay and live with the abuse than leave and think they're going to be killed. And unfortunately, across America, every day, women make that choice, and way too many of them wind up being murdered in the precise ways that they said they were going to be. So I just think that we have to, I just keep going back to this notion that the victim is the expert, and what a difference it makes for her to be listened to. So whatever your role is in this response, if you just take whatever kind of time you can to actively listen to her, and then to point out the strengths that you hear, because there are strengths there. Those are the kinds of things that you can do to help her understand that she's not who she's being told she is by her abuser. She's something entirely different. She's strong and she's smart and she's capable. Part of why this is so important is we're now seeing domestic abusers, as Deborah and I are fully aware of, become mass murderers. And so we kind of need to draw the line in the sand much, much earlier. And in order to draw the line in the sand, that means we have to put our antenna up, and we have to act. We can't just be aware that it's happening. We have to do something. So I very much appreciate being able to be a part of this today. It's always wonderful to hear Evan. I want us to be mindful of the fact that domestic abuse is the core offense that leads to almost everything else that we wind up dealing with in American society. And if we can say just because it happens behind closed doors doesn't mean that it doesn't affect me, if we rethink that and sort of connect the dots between what goes on behind closed doors, what goes on in the public, and what all of us can do to step in and not allow this coercive control to continue, then it will ultimately be a win for the victims, of course, but in the long run, it'll be a win-win for society in general. So I just thank you all for letting me be a part of this. And I think we're probably going to do some Q&A. So I will shut up.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Kit. That was also just incredibly powerful. I'm just taking a deep breath. It's really hard to see those clips each time. Evan, if you're here, if you can come back on the screen, we have some questions that have been submitted that I'm happy to share with you both. I'm not sure, Evan, if you're...
Let's see, I'm back on mic.
Yes, just not on video. So, which is okay, but we'd love to see your smiling face if we can.
The host has stopped my video.
Kyle? Are you there?
I just there it is.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you, Kyle.
I wish there was a way for us to applaud with that kind of sound that you guys deserve, but it's a weird moment. Yeah, all of that. All right, I'm gonna just share with you some of the questions from the chat. Lynn, did you have something that you wanted to add? Or do you want me to go straight into the Q&A?
I think all I wanted to add was that we had all hoped that this would be a full day conference, as you know, and this information is so powerful, but we realize that figuring out how to use and apply this information in an evidence hearing, or if you are in first responding situation, that there needs to be more training and more tools to really be able to realize the goals of these tremendous speakers. This is a start. This is a beginning of a conversation.
Thanks.
Inspire.
I'm also just seeing a couple of people who have asked for more information about Kit's. The movie is Private Violence, and I'll try to type it in the chat, but I'm not good at doing two things at once. It's Private Violence, and you can rent it through Amazon Prime.
You want me to talk about it, Lynn? Do you want me to talk about it, Deborah?
Could you?
Yeah, so Private Violence, it became something else over the years that I was working on it. But ultimately what we did was a case kind of fell in our laps. It was a North Carolina, Western North Carolina, so up in the mountains case where a mom was kidnapped by her estranged husband. He also grabbed their child, put him in an 18-wheeler, had his cousin drive, and they left North Carolina and headed out west in this transfer truck. And the entire time that Robbie had Deanna in the cab of the truck, along with their 3-year-old daughter, Martina, he beat Deanna just relentlessly. There was also a lot of coercive behavior that was going on as well, on top of the physical abuse. And part of why that case became so important is, for me as an advocate, and I'm in North Carolina, I see women who are horrifically abused. And we have a charge in our state called misdemeanor assault with a deadly weapon, which means a woman can be shot or stabbed, and unless it involves damage to a vital organ, it's charged as a misdemeanor. So Deanna was beaten for 5 days. The truck was finally stopped, and she was taken to the hospital along with their little girl. When she was released from the hospital and came back to North Carolina, the local prosecutor, and this is where I'm talking about coercive stuff that happens that's systems-based. The local prosecutor wanted to know why she didn't run when they stopped the truck. Well, she didn't run because Robbie told her if she tried to run, he would kill her and kill Martina. And they were out in the desert in the middle of nowhere. So she stayed in the truck and was beaten for 5 days. What changed the fundamental dynamics of that case, because what Robbie was looking at based on North Carolina law was 90 days in the county jail. But he took her across state lines. And so ultimately the FBI came in and took the case. It went federal. He was charged with federal DV crimes and was sentenced to 21 years in federal prison. And so this is the case that we primarily follow throughout Private Violence, is showing how that whole case occurred. And it's pretty illustrative. It really kind of shows what victims of domestic abuse are up against. It's never just about the abuser, ever. It's also about the systems that she has to turn to for help.
Thanks, Kit. So one of the questions in the Q&A is, how do we manage the risks to children when mothers are not yet ready to leave their coercively controlling partners? Any thoughts, suggestions from either of you about how system actors, advocates, folks who might be on this call might be able to assist children?
Well, I just want to underline the principles that I would apply to the question, because the question is an old question. And if you keep asking the old questions, you're going to come up with the old answers. Mm-hmm. And the old answers haven't worked. So if you know the old answers haven't worked, don't keep asking the old questions. If you don't know what new questions to ask the clients and the women you're working with and the children what questions they have to ask. The first principle I would apply is I would not see the readiness of the mother and the child as separate events. I would see the mother and child as in a similar predicament at different points and facing different dilemmas. I would, look, I don't want to make myself out to be some kind of champion, I have taken kids out of family situations where I believe the children needed to be removed, even though I knew the mother was totally opposed to it and hated my guts as a result of doing it. So I understand that when I say children are secondary victims, I'm not saying that their victimization is secondary in importance. I know a child can be vulnerable and can be at risk in ways that a woman may not be, and that an emergency rescue, if not always the best thing, given whose hands we put the rescued children into, is often the most expeditious intervention. Having said that, I would just make several caveats and I'll stop. I could talk a whole session about this, but the first thing is make sure that whatever you do with a child doesn't change the power relationships between the two remaining partners in a way that disadvantages the primary victim. In other words, very often we rescue children without being aware of the effect of the effect that it has on disempowering the victim. Now, sometimes removing children can empower the victim because the victim may be afraid to leave because of what he'll do to the child. And sometimes I pull children out, often in cooperation with the mother, so that the placement is a safe and temporary placement, so the mother can leave town safely, and the child is hidden away in some place where they're safe. So that can often be the case, but there must not be planning if you recognize that there were dual victims, which doesn't strategize for both. The idea that people are ready to leave is a mistaken idea. First of all, leaving and staying, and we've understood this for 40 years, so this is nothing new to your trainings, I assume. Leaving and staying are part of the same process. They're not one high risk, one is low risk. The nature of the risk may change. Stalking is more dangerous when people leave. Most people who are killed in stalking homicides, and 75% of all stalking is about partners, most people who are killed in stalking homicides are killed after they've separated, not when they're living together. On the other hand, most stalking begins when people are still together. So the idea that stalking is a stranger event is also ridiculous. And that's why we make stalking part of the bespoke offense in Scotland. So that there's no idea of leaving and staying. People have strategically at various points in their relationship, and the other thing you have to stop thinking about is this is not an emergency. We used to think domestic violence was an emergency because the violence was so severe when we saw it. But when you get involved in coercive control, you may be at any one of a number of nodular points in a relationship which have been going on for 20 or 30 years, 5 years, 4 years, 6 years. It's not an emergency. What you want to do is you want to open the door, whether you're a cop or you're an advocate or you're a judge, you want to open the door a little bit so that whatever safety zone the woman has created for herself or the child has created for himself or herself, you can widen just a little bit. You can become part of that safety zone, and the woman can begin to interact more safely with you on an ongoing basis. If you try to rescue in that kind of situation, more often than not, you're closing a safety zone before you found out what it is. It would be it's so complicated. I worked in these families for so many years. I'm blinded by the density of it. But for a judge or an advocate who's on the outside looking in, whenever you use the language of readiness to change, it usually has to do with a projection by the intervener about their own lack of readiness to change. They have to change in the sense that they have to be receptive to the idea that this is a complicated, ongoing reality. Look, in one of the other questions asked me about punishment, is jail good? Does it stop the coercive control? Of course not. I mean, jail is not good for anybody. Whoever said jail was good? I mean, I had the dumbest. Hey, look, jail is not good, but what jail does, we give coercive control men 14 and a half years in prison. in Scotland. That's a sentence. It's a higher sentence you get for anything like kidnapping, murder, you get about 14, 15 years. And coercive control carries 15 years in prison. First offense is 1 year. And, we do that only for politicians usually. They get a year. Like Bill Walker was a member of parliament. He only got a year in prison. So and basically it's a very serious crime. And the reason you put people in jail is because they have committed a very serious crime, not because you think it's going to do any good. Now, do other kinds of programs work for these men? No. The short answer is no. There is no counseling, there's no barriers program, there is no other intervention other than the removal of the woman and child to a place where they can get on with their life projects without intervention that is safe. Now, are there things you're going to have to do? Yes, of course. Coercive control is not a technique. It's not an idea whose time has come. It's an entire approach. And the reason it's nice for you to have an introduction to it so you can get another way of thinking about the people you're working with. It's very important that you see it that way. But the reason they've adopted in England, Scotland, France, and Italy, and China, and Australia, and elsewhere in the world, is because a number of things coincide. I'll just stop here on that. The police were very upset. The police no one is more upset with domestic violence policing than the police. They're more upset than the advocates. They're more frustrated. Yesterday I got an email from somebody on this thing, a cop, who's saying, isn't domestic violence the most dangerous intervention? Police still believe that. I mean, we've disabused police of that. 55 years ago, we were telling police it's the least dangerous intervention, but they still believe it. And police hate domestic violence work. They hate it because when I arrest another officer and I bring them into the police department, it's humiliating, it's embarrassing. We had a guy in the New Jersey State Police who committed 100 domestic violence offenses, and he was still on the job. And the Internal Affairs wanted me to come in and counsel them because they didn't know how to fight. The union wouldn't let them fire him. And the guy, they weren't upset about his domestic violence. They were upset because the guy was pulling down $65,000 a year and he was sitting at a desk. He wasn't doing anything. Because every single time he'd gone before the court, the family judge had thrown out the case, or the criminal judge had thrown out the case, or it was a trivial, it was a nothing case, against 3 different wives. And some of the wives had withdrawn their complaints. I don't know. But the police are more, so we had the police on our side. We had political leadership recognizing they were spending millions and millions and millions of dollars on domestic violence, and they hadn't reduced domestic violence against women 1 percentage point in 50 years. Nor were children safer. So it was cost ineffective. This is before we get into feminism, we get into any other women's rights issues. Plus, our refuges and our shelters were frustrated because we were seeing the same women again and again. We knew the families again and again, and we were not keeping our people safe. As soon as they left refuge, and in England, you can stay in a refuge for 2 or 3 years. As soon as they left the refuge, the guy was still in the community, he was at it again. And the police knew who these guys were. The judges knew who these guys were. Everybody knew. So it was political leadership. The wind of the women's movement was important at our back, but it was the police were on our side, and there was real sentiment on the part of the government that they wanted to save money and do something about this. If you don't have that, and we had judicial leadership. We had the lawyer was the chief defense attorney for the Lockerbie bombers, who was the head judge in charge of domestic violence training in Scotland for police and judges. And he's assumed the responsibility. He's next to God in Scotland. And it's another world. And it's just a different way of thinking. I don't mean to, I'll just stop there. I know I did much more than answer the question. But yeah.
I appreciate it. Can I ask you, there's a question here about what tools exist for working with women and children once they exit a coercive controlling relationship? Are there tools that you recommend for folks who are doing that work? Or Evan?
Listening. I mean, you know, after all these years of being an advocate, and the first day I went through training, we were told that the most important thing we can do is listen. And victims of domestic abuse are unaccustomed to being heard, and they try to articulate their experiences in all kinds of ways, and this is all wrapped up with guilt and shame and fear. And so to create space for them where they can openly talk about the things that they have experienced in a non-judgmental way is, in my experience, the first thing that's going to give them a sense of validity, a sense of compassion, a sense that they don't deserve what's happening to them. And those are kind of the pieces that need to happen in order for her to start to think about things differently. And it's not, getting out of an abusive relationship is not an event, it's a process. And we have to remember that. We have to remember that there's no light switch to flip and everything magically falls into place. It takes time, it takes an investment, it takes knowledge that again, it's not just the abuser, it's also these systems that she's having to deal with. But if we are there for her constantly, consistently, open-mindedly, without judgment, and we say to her, I am just here to listen and help you identify your personal strengths, which are there, and identify the resources that she needs to make the decisions that she feels are appropriate for the circumstances, then she will start to see that she has value as a person. And that's really, in my estimation, the first thing that has to happen.
Thank you. There are lots of questions in the Q&A and some in the chat here, but we are at the end of this program. So please, Dr. Stark, do you want to
I was just thinking, can we go for a couple of questions, or?
I don't know the answer to that.
But what do we stop at 1 or?
We're supposed to stop at 1.
Okay, I'm going to jump in, and if we can go on longer, obviously. I don't know about the technology or anything like that, and Judge DeToro, correct me if I'm wrong, if there's some other reason why we can't go. But this is such an interesting conversation, and I'm with Dr. Stark. Why can't we go a little longer? And unless I hear something else.
Kyle, is this gonna like evaporate, like turn into a pumpkin technologically, or are we okay?
You can keep going past 1.
Okay, so we'll go for just a little bit longer. And okay, let me just look at, so there's a question here. How can courts determine whether a mother's allegations of domestic violence are true, particularly when the other party seems credible?
Well, that's the object of the exercise for the abuser. And that's not just, you know, I mean, this would be an afternoon long conversation. But again, I think this is why it's so important for us to listen to her. Evan can speak to whether or not women abuse the system. In my experience, there are very, very, very few women that I can point to who have stepped in and conjured stuff up that wasn't actually going on. In fact, what my experience has been is the reverse tends to be what's happening most. And by that, I mean that she will come in and talk about one piece of it, but then when you sit down and open up the discussion so that she can articulate the acts of coercive control, the manipulation, the intimidation, all that sort of thing, then you have a much larger set of tactics that she's having to navigate every single day. Evan, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, you know, I mean, to me, the family court is a mysterious place. I never understood why people work there or go there. So I don't understand it. It doesn't fall into what I normally consider law. So, but I look, the first thing I would say is, if there's an allegation of domestic violence by any party, women lie. I don't agree with Kate. I mean, look, you're going into the court. you don't know what the consequence is going to be. You don't know if you talk about your domestic violence, whether it's going to end up hurting you, you're going to lose the children, you're not. In many court cases I've been involved in, evidence of domestic violence is used to show that the children were insensibly exposed, and judges will punish the mother for talking about it. Now, so whenever there's an allegation of domestic violence, I assume you all do this. You have your hearing, a domestic violence hearing should be separate, in camera, before the case in chief is heard. Absolutely. You must resolve the issues of domestic violence, because if there's domestic violence in the room, there cannot be a fair trial. That's as simple as that. Coercive control means that somebody is being coerced, a child, a witness, a victim, and it doesn't matter who. And just the same way you would determine the truth in any issue, you call witnesses, you have hear from the children, you have people who are expert on listening to children, listen to the children, you have advocates come in and talk. You don't let the lawyers just fight out in chief, because sometimes, usually the man can afford a more expensive lawyer. But I don't think there's any easy answer to this, except to say that once coercive control is in the room, that means there is power in the room, and you cannot have a fair trial. It's as simple as that. So you must resolve the issue of whether there's coercive control in the room before you go to the case in chief. Any allocation of resources which takes place with coercive control on the table is going to be inequitable.
I think I absolutely agree.
Deborah, can I do a little pitch here? Deborah has a wonderful piece of scholarship that she has done, only because I'm older now, I can't remember the name of it, but she has
Older than Deborah?
Our
The name
Deborah.
of my name, not the name of my
I know
article.
your name. Anyway, and this actually, how I know Deborah is I read her piece and called her cold and said, "Hi, can you talk to me, please? I love this article." And if you could give us 2 minutes, because I think this is where the toolkit can start to develop, is from the work that you've done.
I really don't think I can, but the article I'm happy to circulate to anyone who's interested. It's about the way that we systematically discount the credibility of women, particularly when women are talking about their experiences of abuse. And I don't mean just physical abuse, but particularly coercive control at the hands of more powerful partners, most typically men. And it just catalogs the ways in which we use stereotypes about who women are, their system gaming, grasping, trying to get custody at all costs, being gold diggers, sort of all kinds of ways in which those stereotypes play out, in which the symptoms of psychological trauma through PTSD and neurological trauma through traumatic brain injuries affect women's testimony in court in ways that run directly counter to the ways in which we assess credibility in court. And so that's the piece. It's illustrated, I think, unlike most law review articles, which are, I hope that it's not as dry and boring as most law review articles, is illustrated by experiences I've had over the past many, many years.
Let me say that one of the effects of having the new law, I don't know if I made this clear, but is for the first time, in order for prosecutors to prosecute a case of coercive control, they have to have women's testimony. I mean, I don't know if I put up the Animal case, or I have another case that we prosecuted very early where he just poured paint on her father's machinery. And that was all he did. And it would have been an absolutely misdemeanor nothing case before. And we got him 2.5 years in prison. And the way we did that was we got her cell phone, which documented 2.5 years of abuse. And we got her making statements which showed that she had experienced the effects of what the law defines as coercive control. Now, what Debbie is saying is true, and of course what kids are saying is true about women don't get taken seriously in the court. But when the law defines as an effect an offense, then a woman's statement about that effect, he made me feel like nothing. He made me feel like dirt. He made me ashamed of myself. That becomes evidence, not hearsay, not he says, she says, but statements of criminal intent and consequence, which have an effect. And it's because women's voices are now being heard in the court that they begin to take on a different standing in the larger community. And when police come to, I had a rape case in Liverpool in which a woman, the rape victim who had been raped in a motel, had just written in lipstick on a piece of toilet paper about what happened. Now, the rape evidence was very weak. She was, in the past, she would have been a very suspect victim. But because the police had learned to take this evidence of what a woman says and had written down on this lipstick, and the police detective who presented this to us.
The microwave just went out.
Anyway, she presented to this evidence. It was incredibly powerful. And the guy was convicted of rape. He wouldn't have gotten anywhere near a rape conviction in the past. Because they had been taught to take a voice seriously. So the issue is not just training people to listen to women. I think the issue is mandated by statute or by design that certain kinds of evidence have to be taken seriously because they bear on certain harms.
Angela, can you mute Angela? Angela, can you mute yourself, please? Thank you.
What I would add to what Evan just said, for those of us who are advocates, is that would be a jumping off place for me to talk with her about how wise she was to write something down on a piece of toilet paper. So if we look at this sort of holistically and think about it in the criminal justice context, and then also think about it in the in the ways in which we can start to work with victims so that they can start to think about themselves as smart and capable and frankly ingenious in a lot of ways. Things like this are. I don't know. That's a great story, Evan. That she had the wherewithal to write something down in lipstick on a piece of toilet paper.
And this speaks to Lynn. And look, what you find in family cases too. I mean, I don't do that many, but you find every woman who has been in coercive control, and I don't care if it's a family case. I don't care if they're completely traumatized, like you say, kid, or what. They have some record of what has gone on. There's something in the household, on the kid's cell phone, on a diary, on the letterhead. I have said, once you start opening up the thing and you start looking for evidence in these cases, it is amazing how much evidence child welfare overlooks and police overlook, because they're looking for physical evidence, because they're looking at statements of, he hurt me. But women document their lives in myriad ways. And it's only as we begin to take into account more and more types of that evidence and tell the judges they should be attending to this evidence. How she dresses herself when she goes to work so that she won't attract the attention, affects her promotion. There is evidence of that from her coworkers.
I would say in many of our cases, we have, because of the gaslighting that goes on,
absolutely,
there is a journal often, not always, but often somewhere during the course of the 10 to 20 years, because the wife says, I'm sure he told me I had to have dinner at 6 o'clock. And when he comes home at 7 and says it was 7, and then there's a lot of trouble, they start journaling their life just to feel like they're not going crazy. That evidence is there.
One of the things that we do in the negotiations class, because the negotiators are so accustomed to, okay, so the hostage victim has a gun held to their head. So in domestic abuse cases, what we try to talk about is the concept of benign hostages, and that what that means is they're being hemmed in by his conduct, by his behavior, by his threats, by his coercion, and there may not be a gun held to her head. But one of the stories that kind of pops into my head is I talked with a social worker over at Appalachian who was working with a woman whose husband had given her a cell phone, and whenever she went to the grocery store and she changed aisles in the grocery store, she had to snap a picture and send it to him immediately so that he knew exactly where she was. And so I say to negotiators in California, imagine that you're at the grocery store this Friday night and you see a woman taking a picture of the aisle in the grocery store. You're probably not going to think that this is a domestic abuse case. But in this case, that's exactly what it was. He was stalking her through her cell phone and with a set of rules and regulations that in effect made her his hostage. But she didn't call it that. She was just busy following all his rules and regulations. So I think that's a, I mean, you're right, Evan, the evidence is there.
One of the great things with kids is that these guys, the teenagers that are giving us this stuff, they have these networks of children in the Girl Scouts and the Boy Scouts who have been sharing information, coercive control. And a lot of these guys are giving their kids cell phones so they can locate them at every point of the day. And it's amazing how when we want to find out where the guys are, the women don't know where they are. The teenagers can get them. They have them on speed dial. Their father's on speed dial. And you can also locate them with the police, can find them that way through the kids, where you can't find them through the wife. And the kids have information on their phones that the fathers have been monitoring. You know, that's really, really fantastic. And the students at school share this stuff. It's amazing how many of the kids talk about what's happening at home. A lot of these school shootings that took place were in the context of extensive coercive control. But you know, that bandit thing, the Washington bandit was a coercive control case. You know, the guy, the highway bandit, remember that? The guy who was shooting from the people from the highway overpass, and he sent his coat. It was all about his getting his wife. And he finally sent his buddy down to kill her, and he wouldn't do it, and that's how they caught him.
Judge Crownhammer and Judge DeToro, can we do one more question? Is that okay?
Yes.
So this is a question from a psychologist in the community. She says, did Dr. Stark say that there's no treatment for these abusers? What does this mean for parenting plans for children after parents have separated or divorced?
I didn't say there was no treatment for them. There may be treatments for them. I said there's no treatment for coercive control. In other words, I don't think that a pattern of behavior that is learned over this period of time, which is as deeply practiced and as refined as any psychotic process would be. In other words, if somebody had a psychotic problem where they repeated themselves, a repetitive compulsive disorder, and they repeated themselves every day by having to order the dishes or track the things in the aisle, we wouldn't try to cure that in a moment or with a piece of medication. We would think about some long-term behavioral therapy. The coercive controlling behavior are learned behaviors which are inculcated in practice for a long period of time and are implemented because for the most part, they work. They don't work in any maximal sense that they produce huge gains. Many of these guys could get what they want sexually by asking for it without any of the devious technologies that they employ to get reassurance. But they work in a much more narrow sense of giving them power and control over an environment which they may not feel otherwise empowered to control. The aim of intervention, our immediate aim of intervention, is to free the children and the woman to breathe the air of free people. Now, Kit may find them in a state of disarray and lack of self-consciousness, and it may require years of advocacy and support. The women that we find increasingly when we free them from forced control and the children are not in that sense of disarray. When you get involved earlier and you get involved before the violence reaches a maximal level, they are empowered in a much greater sense than we are likely to see in our battered women's shelters and programs, and even then we see in our refuges. And the men themselves are empowered in the prison situation or in the confinement situation where they don't have access to the women and children, and they have to develop other technologies for being men and getting their roles taken care of. Now, within the confinement situation, we do have programs for men. And we do have programs where we rehearse their masculinity. We give them ways to feel empowered. We give them access to employment opportunities. We give them all kinds of course, because that's what a good prison system is. It's a system which tries to restore people to function. But it's not a psychological malaise that they have. It's not, there's something deformed about them. Men take power because power is there to be taken. They take it over women and children because women and children are incredibly rich resources, no matter how impoverished a particular woman and child may seem. From our vantage point, from the perspective of a particular man who feels like his resources and his world is deeply impoverished, that isn't the best resource he has. And he feels like he can get control over that. Now, if you can give him some other way to get the same kind of power and control and teach him to be a loving, wonderful father and to embrace his children, great. These children want to be in touch with their fathers. The women want them to be in touch with their fathers because they don't want to spend the whole day taking care of the kids, among other reasons. But they need to be guaranteed that they can be free and they can be independent as children and people when they do that. And right now, these men can't do that. It's not because they're sick.
Can I just jump in real quick, just very quickly and bring up, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, just a second, but I think that I want to introduce people to what's happening in Tel Aviv, Israel. There's a program that was started over there, I think it's 25 years now, and it's called Bet Noam, B-E-I-T-N-O-A-M, and it is a residential treatment facility for abusive men. And what they decided over in Tel Aviv was rather than having women and children flee to a refugee camp, which is essentially what shelters are, they said, no, we don't ask a bank president to move the bank after the bank's been robbed 5 or 6 times. We address the bank robber. And that was kind of what they did in Tel Aviv, was they said, we're going to take the men out of the residence and leave the women and children home to be safe in their own home, which is exactly where they should be safe. And they put the men in this residential treatment facility and give them lots and lots and lots of structure and opportunities to learn how to rearrange how they interact with their wives and children, with the bottom line being, we're going to give you this opportunity to learn how to interact with your family in ways that are non-violent, non-threatening, non-coercive, non-intimidating, and it's up to you. And I would love to see something like that happen in the United States. I don't know that it ever will, but it seems to me the appropriate response, because the more we keep pivoting and saying to women and children, you have to rearrange your life because he happens to be coercively controlling, violent, and abusive, then we're in essence putting the onus on her to rearrange everything about her life because he chooses to be abusive.
There are many things that men used to do to families and children that they no longer do. And they no longer do them, and good men did them, not just bad men. Look, I want the psychologist to stay in business. I want him to have all the patience he can possibly have. But coercive control is not a pathology or a sickness. It's a normal pathology. It's a pathology because it is pathological in its consequences for a free society. To have large numbers of people treated as unfree in their midst. And it's normal because it is reinforced by all the inequalities in the society, not by individual pathologies or by inheritance from men. I've had grandparents who are on the side of the abuser. I have a case now in New York where the grandmother is the worst offender of all behind the barrier. And I've had grandparents, people in the Clinton administration who hired an instructor to help save her daughter, you know, with the FBI. It's not an intergenerational problem. It's a problem of permission and changing the norms of the community so that people can, and it's not about safety. As long as we keep the one message I have for today is that if we keep our eye on safety and physical violence, we are not going to help the women and children in our care. It is about dignity and freedom. It is about the basic rights of people to have their own way of life in their own space, in their own life. And when men recognize this, and men who recognize this can live with us, and men who do not recognize this cannot. They cannot live with us as politicians, and they cannot live with us as football players, and they cannot live with us as bank presidents, and they cannot live with us as fathers and uncles. And all the psychological care in the world is not going to change that reality. And women are not going to accept it, and neither will children.
Well, that is the perfect note to end on, I think. Thank you so much. I just want to personally take 1 second to thank both Dr. Stark and Kit Gruelle for just an incredibly interesting and powerful conversation.
They lock us in, so we can focus on locked in for 8 months.
I know. I hope this is just the beginning of a conversation, but I'm going to turn it over, I think, to Judge DeToro to just wrap us up.
Thank you. And just very quickly, I want to thank everyone who helped us today. I think it is the beginning of a conversation that at a macro level will help all of us protect community safety and to ensure basic rights all across the family court. I want to thank everyone for attending. It's our first virtual conference on our 18th annual Interdisciplinary Family Court Conference. A special thank you to the Family Court Planning Committee under the guidance of our co-chairs, Magistrate Judge Kenya Seone Lopez, who's here, and to Professor Deborah Epstein of Georgetown and Lynn Delaney from Delaney Stafford, who brought this topic to us over a year ago. It is, as Professor Epstein said, Ms. Delaney's life's work, and I hope that this is a good first step and that we keep working together on it. Obviously, I'd also like to thank our speakers, Dr. Stark and Ms. Gruelle, who've given us so much information and really made an impact today. I'd also like to thank Kyle Bernardos for all the technical support, Mr. Shack for the website, and Mr. Chang for registration, Jaron Horton, Angela Naylor, and the incomparable Crystal Banks for all the planning, our Court Center for Education and Training, and the Court Strategic Management Division for the evaluations you're going to get. Everyone on the webinar today will receive an evaluation. When you get it, you'll have it in your email. Please complete it and send it back. It's how we'll make this better every year. And I'm hoping to see everyone next year. It'll be our 19th annual Family Court Conference, and I'm hoping it'll be at our usual location where we can see each other face to face. Thanks to everyone for joining us. Please stay safe, and I hope that your families and you are well.
Thank you.